Do you ever hear some real Japanese out in the wild? Not the easy stuff in classrooms and textbooks. And you hear it and you just think, I'll never be able to understand this language. I'd like to change that for you. In this video, we'll start at 0 and we'll work our way up to what would be very challenging even for a rather advanced learner of Japanese. We'll do that by breaking down a 1 minute and 40-second conversation. Even if you're at a rather advanced level of Japanese, say maybe like milestone 40 in NativShark if you're using NativShark, and please do check it out if you haven't because I'm helping to build it and I think it is the best way to learn Japanese. But yeah, even if you're at that level, I think this conversation is going to have some parts that are very difficult for you to catch. And if you're more at a beginner level, it might seem unfathomable that you could ever understand everything that's being said in this short conversation. But you can understand real world, natural speed Japanese, even if it sounds impossible at the moment, I promise. We just need to take it one concept at a time. As we proceed through this video, I'll try to explain things so that even if today is your very first day of learning Japanese, you can see how concepts stack upon one another to build up into a natural conversation. Are you ready? To start, I'll play the clip, which is from a podcast that I like to listen to, and the two Japanese hosts of the show are talking about visiting shrines and temples at New Year's. And in particular, they're talking about two sweet treats that you can get at shrines and temples around New Year's, aaaagh and oshiruko. Aaaagh is a traditional sweet drink made from fermented rice, and oshiruko is a sweet porridge made from azuki beans with mochi in it. Now, while the clip is playing, I'll put a transcription of the Japanese on the top half of the screen, and I'll put an English translation on the bottom half. So if you're an advanced learner, maybe just look away from the screen and see how much of the conversation you can understand. And if you're more intermediate, maybe cover the bottom of the screen and just try to read along with the Japanese transcription. And if you're more beginner, or if you just get lost along the way, feel free to just read the translation on the screen as we go through the conversation. Much later in this video, we'll listen to this clip again, and I think you'll notice a stark difference in the amount of stuff that you understand from this first listening right now. So, okay, let's listen.
甘酒とおしるこだったらどっちが好き？
究極の二択や。
なんか年明けて、夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど、そこで甘酒とおしるこが売られてたってか自由に取っていいよってなってて、すごい悩んで甘酒にしたの。私は
甘酒かも。
でもなんか母親がおしるこ取ってて、で一口飲ませてもらったんだけど、ちょっとおしるこめっちゃうまかった。
マジか。
でなんかあれおしるこにすればよかったかなって一瞬思ったね。
なんかどっちが好き？焼いてある餅を入れるおしること、溶けそうな餅が入ってるおしるこ。
私もこれは圧倒的に溶けそうな餅。
私も溶けそう。
やっぱり
めちゃくちゃ美味しいよね。白いね。
トロトロの餅。あれが最高。餅はねやっぱねとろけそうなやつの方が好きなんだよね。
そうなんだよね。でも硬い餅の方が、なんかこう食べ損ねても長く食べれる感じはあるよね。
餅がいい。餅だけに
餅がいいので食べられる感じはある。
確かになんかうちの親とかは硬い餅がめっちゃ好きなの。
そうなんだ。
あえてなんかちょっと硬くして食べてるね。
へえ。
そういう人もいるんだって思うんだけど、私はもうトロトロの餅がいいです。
餅ね。あとはやっぱ甘酒は、でっかい鍋で作られててよいしょみたいな入れられるやつがめっちゃ好き。
それを知らんかった。なんか私がもう紙コップに小分けになったやつをもらって
それ元は大きい鍋入ってたんだよ多分。
そうなの？
で誰か作ってくれてんだよ。
How much did you catch? If you caught everything or almost everything, that would mean you're up here at the top of our Japanese comprehension ladder, so to speak. And if you understood almost nothing, you'd be down here at the bottom. Or maybe you're somewhere in between. And in any case, I'm going to try to get you closer to the top of that comprehension ladder right now. The first sentence was...
甘酒とおしるこだったらどっちが好き？
It's like this part right here. Let's listen to it a few times.
甘酒とおしるこだったらどっちが好き？甘酒とおしるこだったらどっちが好き？甘酒とおしるこだったらどっちが好き？
Okay, so which do you like better? Amazake or oshiruko? Word by word, that sentence is saying amazake and oshiruko if it were, which... And then the particle ga, which we'll talk about a lot later. Liking, which more naturally we can translate as something like, which do you like better, amazake or oshiruko? In that first little phrase, amazake to oshiruko, we hear all 5 of the vowel sounds of Japanese, a, i, u, e, and o. You can imagine Japanese as being broken up into these distinct syllables, so to speak, and almost all of them will be either one of those 5 vowel sounds that we just saw. Like, for example, in that phrase, we see the a in amazake and the o in oshiruko. So a and o are 2 of the 5 vowel sounds. And then the other syllables you hear the most often is a consonant vowel pairing, like we see in mazake and shiruko. So amazake to oshiruko, and to in between them is also a consonant vowel pairing. That first word, amazake, is written using 2 kanji. Kanji are characters that were imported from China hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And the literal meanings of those 2 characters are sweet and alcohol. So amazake is literally sweet alcohol. And it actually does contain alcohol, but it's typically less than 1%. So even kids are usually allowed to drink it in Japan. I should mention that in your first few years, maybe your first several years of learning Japanese, kanji can be very intimidating, and learners have a tendency to hyper-focus on them, which I think is not beneficial. Instead, you can just use a holistic learning material like, this video or NativShark. If you are particularly worried about kanji, I have other videos about that, and I'll put links to them. After the word amazake, we have the particle to, which you can think of as meaning and. So particles are this unique thing about Japanese, and you can just think of them as kind of like glue that holds pieces of a sentence together. And like kanji, this is another thing that learners, especially in their first couple of years, tend to hyper-focus on and get very stressed about. But you can't not learn particles because they're such a common and fundamental piece of the language. So you'll just learn them. Don't worry about it. One way you'll learn them is by doing stuff like this and seeing them used in natural Japanese in real-world contexts, like connecting to nouns, amazake and oshiruko, putting to between them to mean and. The particle to, and, is not written using kanji. It's written using hiragana. So in Japanese, they have these 2 syllabaries, which you can think of as like the alphabet of Japanese. And one of them is hiragana, and there are 46 characters you need to learn, and to is one of them. And remember earlier I said that there's lots of these consonant vowel combos or standalone vowel sounds, syllables. Well, all of those individual syllables can be represented with 1 kana, kana being the blanket term for hiragana and katakana. Earlier I said amazake to oshiruko, so that's like 9. There are 9 different hiragana you could use to represent those sounds. If you don't know hiragana yet, or you've only studied it a little bit, it's going to seem like I'm going too fast in this video, but don't worry about being able to remember all those characters after only seeing them a couple times. That will happen over a long period of time as you get lots of exposure to Japanese. Now, if I'm writing this and I write amazake in kanji, some people might not know how to pronounce it. And if I wanted to make it easier for them, I could put little hiragana characters above each of the kanji to show how they're pronounced. So I could put ama over the one that means sweet, and I could put zake over the one that means alcohol. And when I do that, then a person would be able to know that even if they're not familiar with this word, it is pronounced amazake. When you put hiragana over kanji like this, it's called hiragana. So those are the hiragana for this word. If we also put hiragana over oshiruko, it would look like this. We have o in hiragana, and then over the 2 kanji, we have shiruko. That first kanji with shiru over it means something like soup or broth, and then ko means something like powder or flour, dust, not dust, meal, like ground up stuff. And that hiragana o at the front is called an honorific prefix. For some words, it's common to put honorific prefixes before them, and it's not necessarily to make your speech sound more formal or to show respect to some word. This is one of those things you just get a sense for when to do or not do, and in many cases, either option is fine. But yeah, typically, it's very common to put the honorific prefix o in front of shiruko, making the word oshiruko. So, amazake to oshiruko, amazake and oshiruko. And then after that, we have our first little bit of grammar. We have this word dattara. So in Japanese, there's this thing called the copula. If you're interested in linguistics, the copula is a word or phrase that links the subject of a sentence to a subject complement, such as the word is in the sentence, the sky is blue. But more generally, you can just think of the copula as meaning is or was, just the verb to be in Japanese. See that datta part of dattara? So datta is the past tense of the copula. So it often can be translated to something like was. And when you put that ra onto the past tense of the copula, it makes dattara, which is the conditional form of the copula. So it's an if statement. That's why in the literal translation, I put if it were, or something like that. Amazake and oshiruko if it were. In other words, if you're choosing between amazake and oshiruko. Do you remember how I said that in Japanese, syllables are either standalone vowels or these consonant vowel pairings? Like we have the vowel sound a in the consonant vowel pairings here 3 times in the word. We have da, ta, and ra. But did you notice in the English transcription, we have these like 2 T's next to each other in da-da-da? That's because of this little character, this little tsu. When that character is normal size, it is pronounced tsu, like the tsu in tsunami. But when it's a small one, it indicates a double consonant, or if you're into linguistics, gemination. In Japanese, it's called sokuon, literally stimulate, urge, demand, and then sound. So it's demanding an extra sound that is an extra consonant. It's a double consonant. That's why the transcription is not da-da-da, it's da-da-da, with that like little extra thing at the T sound. You have to hold that T sound for longer than usual. That's what I should say. Hang in there. The first sentence is going to take us the longest because we just have a lot of foundation to lay before we get into more Japanese. And speaking of which, please don't try to memorize anything in this video. I am introducing Japanese concepts to you. It's like a meet and greet at a party. You don't have to take notes or memorize anything I'm saying in this video. Instead, I would urge you to just watch the whole thing and then go study Japanese elsewhere, whether it's with NativShark or whatever, for, several weeks or months, and then come back and watch this video again and see how much more you understand. But yeah, there's no quiz. This is not a test. Even when you come back to this video several weeks or months from now, there will be some things that you then understand totally, other things that seem more understandable, and some things that still seem a little over your head. And that's what you should feel like. That's natural. That's what it's like when you're learning the language. It just happens gradually, bit by bit. So just stay with me, okay? No pressure. Okay, so far we have, let's listen to it again.
甘酒とおしるこだったら
甘酒とおしるこだった。Literally, amazake and oshiruko if it were. So if it were between amazake and oshiruko, that's the hypothetical situation being presented to the listener. And her question about that hypothetical situation is, どっちが好き? That's what she says in the second half. It's like,
どっちが好き?
どっちが好き? Ski, that's suki, means something like liking or favored. The u sound in suki is commonly unvoiced. That's why it probably sounds more like ski to you than suki. That's very common. Then we have dochi, which means which. That's do and chi, with sokuon, the gemination, in the middle, in between them. So we know that that chi sound has an extra consonant at the beginning. It's not dochi, it's dochi, dochi, which. We've got almost the whole sentence now, and word by word is probably starting to make a little more sense. Amazake and oshiruko, if it were, which, and then liking. So if it were amazake or oshiruko, which do you prefer? And right before tsuki, we have this particle, another particle. This one is ga, which is typically called the subject marking particle because it marks the subject. And by marks, I mean it comes right after the subject, so to speak, of a Japanese sentence. In many situations, I like to think of it as the pointer particle. It's pointing at the word that comes right before it. And the word that comes right before it in this sentence is dochi. So ga is pointing at dochi, which means that that is being identified as something that's being asked about. In other words, which would you prefer? It just so happens that in English also, which would you prefer, amazake or oshiruko, which is also the subject of that English question. We just don't have subject marking particles in English, so I don't have to say which ga do you like better, amazake or oshiruko. I can just say which do you like better, amazake or oshiruko. Like I said earlier, please feel free to be very interested in particles, but please don't be worried about which one you should or should not use in a particular situation until you're at a very proficient level of Japanese. You will get used to them over time, the same way that a learner of English has to get used to articles if they don't have them in their own language, like and the, and when to use which one and how it changes the nuance of a sentence. And we did it. We got through the whole first sentence of our conversation. Let's listen to it again. I'm going to play it.
甘酒とおしるこだったらどっちが好き?
甘酒とおしるこだったらどっちが好き? So which do you prefer, amazake or oshiruko? And you can take amazake and oshiruko out of that sentence and replace them with 2 other things if you want to make a which would you prefer question. For example, I could put like inu, dog, and neko, cat, into there and say, inu to neko dattara dochi ga suki? Which would you prefer? Or which do you like better, dogs or cats? Do note that this is a casual question. The 2 hosts of the show are friends, and so they used casual Japanese with one another. I'm not going to get too much into formality in this video because the whole conversation is between 2 friends, but there are a few things I do need to mention. 1, formality is a major part of Japanese. 2, Formality is not a dichotomy. We don't have like casual over here and formal over here, and it's either this one or this one. It's more like a spectrum, and people move back and forth across that formality spectrum within single conversations and often even within single sentences. 3, don't be too worried about messing up the formality in your own Japanese. Unless you're at a very, very advanced level already, you're gonna mess it up. I guarantee it. And almost all native speakers are gonna give you a break because they know that it's difficult to navigate that kind of thing when you're learning a new language. Okay, our next sentence is... That's probably really hard to catch, right? Here, I'll play it again. Okay, so what? The ultimate dilemma. Literally, that's something like, ultimate no choice, yeah. The first part, that is not really a word. It's just like a sound that you make. Maybe we could translate it as like, wow, yikes, The 2 hiragana we have are u and wa, and there's that like horizontal bar in between them. That indicates that the vowel sound coming before it should be elongated. So it's not just ua, it's ua. Now, I'm guessing that for most people watching this, the next part, this it must be almost impossible for you to catch, right? Don't worry, that's normal. The specific sounds she's saying are kyu, kyoku, no, sentaku, ya. Hopefully I got that right. Well, let's imagine that she's clearly enunciating each of those syllables. Even then, there are some things we have not seen before here. There are 3 different syllables that start with a Y sound in Japanese. There's ya, you, and yo. We see one of them at the very end of this phrase, the ya that she says at the end of kyukyoku no sentaku ya. When these Y sound characters are smaller, though, they indicate that the character before it should be pronounced differently. For example, ki plus a little u gives us Q, like a bit like the letter Q in English, whereas ki plus a little yo gives us kyo, like the kyo in Kyoto or Tokyo. That's why this word is pronounced kyukyoku. Say that 10 times fast. Kyukyoku. Additionally, we have the n in sentaku. This is the only hiragana in Japanese that does not contain a vowel sound. Usually it gets written as an N in English, but it's more like a nasally N, or sometimes it's more like the NG sound, like the N in like king. It's like that like sound in it. Sentaku. But if you're just getting started, you can just think of it as N and worry about that little stuff later. No big deal. The phrase kyukyoku no sentaku means something like the ultimate choice. Kyukyoku means like ultimate or final, and then sentaku means choice, option. And there in between them we have no, so which sentaku, choice. Kyukyoku, I can't say this today. Kyukyoku no sentaku, it's an ultimate choice or decision. The particle no is connecting them. What type of sentaku choice? A kyukyoku one, so kyukyoku no sentaku. I'm just gonna let her say it. The other girl on the exhales into her mic, so it's almost impossible to hear that sen part of sentaku. So you can't hear the sen in sentaku. So how do I know that she's saying that? Over the years in helping people learn Japanese, I've gotten so many messages that say things like, I just can't catch this one part of the sentence, or you said that person A is saying XYZ, but it sounds more like ABC to me. Or I'm still having trouble understanding what this person is saying. My listening needs improvement. But in cases like these, almost always the problem is not your ability to catch the sounds being said in Japanese. The problem is your lack of knowledge of the language as a whole. An advanced student of Japanese or a native speaker does not need to hear the sen part and sentaku because they know that this set phrase, kyukyoku no sentaku, an ultimate choice or dilemma, is something that people say, and it makes sense for her to be saying it here when she was asked which she likes better, amazake or oshiruko, which is a dilemma. This doesn't happen very often in Japanese learning materials, unless you're using NativShark, so please check it out, where it's not possible to hear what the person is saying syllable by syllable. You need to have the context of what they might be saying or what makes sense to say, and the words around it can fill in those gaps for you. It's so common for this to happen out in the real world, especially outside of media. Sometimes it's impossible to catch every sound a person is trying to say while still being able to catch what they are intending to say. That's completely normal to happen in a language, and the solution is not to slow down the audio. The solution is to learn more words and phrases in rich contexts. Your brain will get very good at filling in the gaps once it learns what kinds of things go in those gaps usually. Have faith, it gets easier. Next, let's talk about the ya at the end of this sentence. In this case, ya is a sentence ending particle. That is a particle you put at the end of a sentence to change its meaning or nuance. For example, take a look at this lesson on NativShark called Different Ways to Use Ya at the End of a Sentence. You can put ya after a verb in command form, in which case it makes the command sound rougher. You can also put it after viyo, in which case it's basically the same as yo, but it sounds a bit more kansai-like. So it's morning and you're just about to take your kid to elementary school when they tell you they're supposed to bring 4 cardboard tubes from toilet paper rolls and 2 milk cartons to class today. You think to yourself,
早く言えや。
早く言えや。
早く言えや. Tell me earlier. Soon say ya. But it's the ya we see in Kyukyoku no Sentaku ya is not this ya, and there's also another one at the bottom of this lesson. Note that the above uses of ya are different from using ya to lighten or soften the nuance of something you're saying, as in, your taxi driver asked you to pay an amount that's clearly more than it should be. You think to yourself,
ぼったくられてる。まあいいや。
ぼったくられてる。まあいいや。
ぼったくられてる。まあいいや. That ya at the end of, well, good, yeah. So that also is a different ya than the one we see in Kyukyoku no Sentaku ya. To find the usage, we actually need to go look up one of our many Kansai dialect lessons. I think it's more Kansai dialect, this one right here. If I scroll down, okay, you see here where it says ya can be used in place of da. Da, that's like da, the copula. We saw the copula earlier in dattara, right? Ya can be used in place of da, and de can be used in place of yo. Accordingly, ending a phrase with ya de in Kansai dialect is a bit like ending one in dayo in standard Japanese. Your girlfriend opened up a restaurant. She's telling you about how she didn't hire a newlywed woman because she didn't want her to get pregnant and quit immediately after.
それ立派な差別やで。
それ立派な差別やで。
それ立派な差別やで. So, you know that's textbook discrimination, right? In other words, the speaker in our conversation when she said Kyukyoku no Sentaku ya is just using ya as another version of the copula, so to mean like is or something, and that's just her personal preference. She could say nothing there if she wanted. It's not necessarily an indication that she's from Kansai, because lots of people try to use Kansai dialect here and there, even if they're not from that area. It's just a way that she's adding her own personal flavor to her Japanese.
うわ、究極のタクや。うわ、究極のタクや。
Great. So now we can get into the long sentence that comes after this, which is setting up the scene for our story that's going to be discussed in the clip. The first half of that long sentence is
なんか年明けて、夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど
So I translated that as for the start of the new year, I went to the shrine near my house around midnight, and before I get into why I translated it like that, I want to point out what's missing from this translation, which are the i-adjectives. I-adjectives are like these sounds that you use in Japanese to indicate to a person that you're listening or engaged with what they're saying. So the other girl is saying which means like yeah, yes, okay. It's got 2 characters, right? And then so it means like yeah. She says it twice, so listen for her to say it.
なんか年明けて、夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど、なんか年明けて、夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど、
In English, we tend to make sounds in the middle of someone else's sentence when we want to interject and say something. Whereas in Japanese, they do that to indicate that they're listening. So there's this weird thing where if you don't use i-adjective and make those sounds in Japanese, sometimes a Japanese person will stop talking because they're not sure if you're following or engaged with what they're saying. And then conversely, if you start doing that in English, which is a bad habit I have developed, people will stop talking because they think that you want to interject and say something. Please look forward to developing similar bad habits as you progress through your Japanese studies. Okay, so the speaker starts with なんかなんかand I translated that as so. The word nanka means something like something or something like, but it can also be used as a filler word, and that's how it's being used here, which you can use to say, to figure out what you want to say. Ano means something like and you can draw out that final o vowel sound at the end if you want. So she doesn't say ano, she could say ano, but she says ano.
なんか、
なんか、so, then she says, 年明けて. So, right here, let's play it.
年明けて、
年明けて. So, 年 means year, and the verb 明ける means something like to dawn. So the phrase 年が明ける means something like the new year dawns. But she's omitting the particle ga, which is very common in spoken language. And she doesn't say 明ける with a ru at the end because that would be dictionary form. Instead, she is using the te form. She's saying 明けて. So in a dictionary, Japanese verbs always end in an u sound. Specifically, they can end in u, gu, ku, gu, su, tsu, nu, bu, mu, or ru. Yeah, 9 possible endings for verbs, and they all end in that u sound. Verbs are divided into 3 categories. First, there's ichidan verbs. These ones always end in ru in dictionary form. This makes sense because ichi means one, and ichidan verbs only have 1 possible ending. Conjugating ichidan verbs is really easy because all you ever do is drop off the final ru and then replace it with something else. Like here, akeru is an ichidan verb, so she just drops off the ru and puts te to make it into te form, akete. And the reason she uses te form here is because that form can be used when you're describing a sequence of actions or events. She isn't just telling us that the new year dawned, the new year dawned, and then something else happens, which she's about to tell us. The other main category of verbs are godan verbs. Go means 5. So you would think that this means there's 5 possible endings, but actually they can have all 9 possible endings. But you can still use that to remember that, go is more than 1, so this must be the one that has lots of endings. Conjugating godan verbs is less straightforward than conjugating ichidan verbs, but I still think Japanese verb conjugation is pretty easy, especially if you compare it to a language like, say, Spanish, where you have to worry about who is the subject of the sentence, and there's no subjunctive mood in Japanese, and there's also not even a future tense. Present and future are the same tense in Japanese. Additionally, the final category of verbs in Japanese is irregular, but there's only a couple of irregular verbs, not like, say, in English, where there are so many irregular verbs. Anyway, 年明けて, New Year dawned, and...
なんか、年明けて、夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど、
Okay, so the next part is...
夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、
Let's play it a few times.
夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、
夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、middle of the night, no, 12 o'clock, past, after, about, around, ni. Which 12時, 12 o'clock, the yonaka, middle of the night one. So yonaka no 12時, middle, as we use no again to connect those 2 nouns. Yonaka no 12時, so 12 in the middle of the night, i.e. midnight. And because, by the way, a lot of people in Japan go to shrines or temples at or around 12 midnight on New Year's Eve.
That was in the Japan trains.
It was?
Yes. There were magnets.
Magnets in the Japan trains?
Yes.
Thank you for sharing. Can you close the door, please? Here again, we have a small Y sound character, changing the pronunciation of the character that comes before it. So first you can take shi, and if you put these 2 little things next to it, those are called takuten, those little quotation mark things, it becomes ji. And if you put a small yu next to it, it becomes ju. So, and then you can put u after that. So it's like a long u sound at the end, ju, and that means 10. And then ni is 2, so ju ni is 10, 2, and that's how you say 12 in Japanese. And then she says ji, which is like o'clock, so juniji, 12 o'clock. And then after that, she puts the suffix sugi, which means like past or after. So juniji sugi means after 12 o'clock. And then after that, she says gurai, which means about or around. So juniji sugi gurai, at around after 12 o'clock or so. Look at what happens when you have an i sound after an a sound in that word gurai. It's not gurai. I mean, I guess if you said it very slowly, it would be, but instead it's gurai, that a and e combine to make an I sound like your I, gurai. And speaking of pronunciation, we've now seen the Japanese R sound 2 times. We saw it in the word oshiruko, that du, and we saw it in gurai, that da in dai. And this is not like the R sound in English. So an unnatural English speaker sounding pronunciation of those words would be oshiruko with like a sound, or gurai. You don't say that in Japanese. It's oshiruko or kurai. My tongue is not as far back in my mouth as it would be for an English R sound, but it's also not as far forward as it would be for an L sound, because my tongue does not touch my teeth like it does with an English L sound. So it's not oshiruko and it's not oshiruko, it's oshiruko, and it's not gurai and it's not gulai, it's gurai. Dai. If you can't say it correctly yet, I wouldn't worry about it. Just try to practice little by little over time and pay attention to how other people are saying it. Okay, so 夜中の12時過ぎくらい, or at around after midnight, and then she adds the particle ni after that. So ni is a particle that can have many uses, but one of those uses is indicating the time at which something was done. So here it's a bit like the English word at around midnight, 12時過ぎくらいに, and then she says,
一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど、
right there.
一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど、一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど、一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど、
一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど、一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど. So literally, that's number one near no shrine ni went んだけど. The number of things that are not translatable in our word-by-word breakdowns is increasing. We can combine ichiban, which means number one, or the most, and then chikaku, which means near, to make the phrase ichiban chikaku, so the closest, the nearest. And then jinja, shrine, and this is the last time that I will mention that a small y sound character can change the sound of what comes before it. So at the end there, that ja sound is because we have ji and then a small ya, so jinja, shrine. Which jinja, shrine? The ichiban chikaku, closest one. So we can put the particle no between those to combine them. Ichiban chikaku no jinja, the nearest shrine to my house or whatever. The verb iku means to go, and here it's in the past tense, itta. So this is one of those rare cases of an irregular verb conjugation. Normally when a verb ends in ku, and that's a godon verb, by the way, which we know because it does not end in ru. Usually a verb ending in ku would not be changed into this ta ending for plain past tense. This is a special verb, so people say itta. And if you're curious as to why that's the case, normally when a verb ends in ku and you want to change it to plain past tense, you would change that ku to ita, but this verb starts with i, so it would be like saying ita, which is kind of just weird to say. So instead, it became an irregular verb, itta. And this verb is so common that you don't need to think about why it's conjugated that way. You will hear it so many times that you cannot not learn how to say this in various tenses. So yeah, itta is went, and before it is the particle ni again. Only this time, ni is not indicating the time at which something happened. Instead, it's indicating the destination to which someone went. So nitta is went to. And what destination is ni marking? Well, like any particle, we should look at what comes before it to see what it's marking. So ichiban chikaku no jinja ni itta. So ni is pointing at ichiban chikaku no jinja, the nearest shrine, and that's where she went. So ichiban chikaku no jinja ni itta, went to the nearest shrine. And then after that, we get the fun stuff that is very specific to Japanese. We have ndakedo. Kedo is often translated as but, and sometimes this is an accurate translation, but what's even more common is that kedo is just indicating that there's still more to be said after this. So it's like a content marker. It's saying that, hey, I'm not done talking, and that you can use it whether or not you actually keep talking. It doesn't mean that I'm going to say more, but it does mean that I could or might say more. And that's because she has more to tell us about what happened when she went to the nearest shrine around midnight. By far, the hardest part of this sentence for me to explain to you is this nda in ndakedo. And after well over a decade of teaching people Japanese, this is one piece of the language that I still struggle to concisely explain to my fellow learners. And yeah, I can use it naturally in my own Japanese, but sometimes trying to explain why it is or is not used in a sentence is kind of tricky for me. While I will usually try to explain what that means, for the most part, just try to learn by vibes. Let the Japanese flow through you over time until you just get a sense for how to use it. Yeah, but the basic and common explanation of unda is that it is an explanation marker. So it's used at the end of a phrase when you're explaining something, but it can be easy to overthink what is or is not being explained if you try to break down every single sentence. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Suffice it to say that it would just sound a little off if she did not include unda in her sentence. If she just said something like, ichiban chikaku no jinja ni itta kedo, instead of ittandakedo, it just doesn't quite sound as natural. And I think that's because she's in the middle of setting up a scene for us. Okay, so we had...
なんか年明けて、夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど。
So, for the start of the new year, I went to the shrine near my house around midnight, and then she tells us what happened next.
そこで甘酒とおしるこが売られてたってか、自由に取っていいよってなってて、すごい悩んで甘酒にしたの、私は。
Okay, so I translated that whole big long sentence as they were selling. I mean, not selling, but they had amazake and oshiruko that you could take for free, and I had such a hard time deciding which one to take, but I decided on amazake. I'll be honest, for a second there, I was a little bit overwhelmed when I saw how long this sentence is, and I was thinking about how to explain it to you. So let's take a deep breath. But that's what learning Japanese feels like sometimes, right? You see all these words, all these kanji, all this grammar, and it's all packed together in some huge block of text or audio. And you think, this is just too much. But if we just take it one concept at a time, I think we'll find that we can understand even those big blocks of words and kanji and grammar and everything else. I will say it's nice that if you have a learning material that does introduce concepts one at a time and not all at once. So if you had a material like NativShark, for example, where they just teach you one concept at a time, that makes it a little bit less intimidating. Anyway, word by word, the start of this sentence was soko, there, de, a location marking particle, amazake, to, which is a particle meaning and, oshiruko, and then ga, the subject marking particle. And then the other girl interjects with ooh, like, which we saw earlier is like, ugh. Maybe we could just translate it as, she's just indicating that it would be a hard decision with her aizuchi. Let me hear her say that again.
そこで甘酒とおしるこがそこで甘酒とおしるこが
Then the rest of the sentence, and this is a lot. So we had 売られてた was being sold. 売られてた again was being sold. てか or rather 自由に freely, literally free or freedom plus the particle ni, which makes it into an adverb. 取って take and いい good or fine. よ which is an emphasis marking particle. で which is a sort of quote or phrase marking particle. More on that later. なってて so literally that's is becoming. すごい amazing. 悩んで have trouble deciding and 甘酒 nishita, which is like decided on, and then no, which is an explanation particle, just like we saw earlier with unda, and then atashi, which is a feminine word for I, and then wa, which is the topic marking particle. That's a lot, right? You know, I used to see or hear long sentences like these in Japanese, and I would think, yeah, I'm just never going to be able to string together these super long sentences in my own Japanese, and it was kind of discouraging to think. But I think it's worth mentioning that a native speaker is not necessarily, they don't have like a blueprint in their mind of everything they're going to say in the sentence. They kind of just wing it as they go. And that's why, for example, in this sentence, she actually restates what she's trying to say a couple of times, because she wants to, you know, make what she wanted to say more clear or add something later. It's not a beautiful grammatically structured sentence, so to speak. The first example of this is when she says, I need to get better at switching from English to Japanese. She says, 売られてた, 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 売られてたってか. Let's just listen to it.
売られてた、売られてたってか.
Let's hear it a few times.
売られてた、売られてたってか. 売られてた、売られてたってか. 売られてた、売られてたってか.
売られてた、売られてたってか. てか. That's hard to say fast, huh? So, 売られてた means was being sold, but this phrase, 売られてたってか means something like was being sold, or rather, not was being sold, but the verb uru means to sell. Remember how all ichidan verbs end in ru? Well, uru is not an ichidan verb, it's a godan verb. And you might be wondering how we can know if a verb is ichidan or godan if it ends in ru. And there are some clues. For example, the clue here is that the vowel sound coming before that ru is u. Whereas with ichidan verbs, usually the vowel sound coming right before the final ru is i or e. So that's a clue that it's a godan verb. Although I don't think you really need to worry about this kind of stuff. With common verbs, you just learn how they're conjugated from hearing them specifically in so many situations. Okay, so we're about to do our first nested verb conjugation, so to speak. It's a verb that is conjugated multiple ways in one utterance. First, the passive form of the verb uru, to sell, is urareru, so to be sold. That's the first conjugation. But then we need to conjugate this passive form. So we need to conjugate urareru into a different tense. And the passive form of this verb, so urareru, does conjugate like an ichidan verb. And it's worth mentioning that the vowel sound right before ru is e, because urareru, urareru. So we're going to conjugate that. Since it conjugates like an ichidan verb, that means it's easy for us to conjugate. You just drop off the final ru and replace it with something else. For example, if we wanted to put this verb, urareru, to be sold into past tense, plain past tense, you could just drop the ru and replace it with ta, urareta, was sold. But the speaker in our sentence did not say urareta, was sold. She said urareteta, was being sold. The teiru ending is used to make the present progressive in Japanese. You know, like saying is doing in English. So urareteiru, so you drop the ru, urareru, urareteiru is being sold. But then we need to put that into past progressive, so like was doing. So that final ru of urareteiru is urareteita, was being sold. So you saw the urareteita, there's like an e in there, and that's how it's supposed to be written. But in spoken language, people often drop that e in the auxiliary verb. So she just says urareteta, was being sold. This is one of the most complex verb conjugations we are going to see in this video. So if that felt a little bit overwhelming, please don't worry about it too much. Most people don't work with nested conjugations like these until they are many months into their Japanese studies. Someday you'll reach the point where these conjugations just flow out of your mouth without you even thinking about them. It happened for me, and it'll happen for you too. Anyway, urareteta, was being sold, and she says that twice, right? Urareteta, urareteta teka.
Urareteta teka.
Did you hear her say it twice? Urareteta, urareteta teka. I can't say teka at the end of that. Urareteta, urareteta teka. Okay, anyway. The second time she says it, she puts teka at the end of it. Teka is an abbreviation of teyuka, which is a spoken form of toyuka. To and te are quotation markers, so to speak. Basically, they mark the words or phrases that came before them. And then you, so you means to say, and then ka is a question marking particle. And you put all that together and you get toyuka or teyuka or teka. And it's a way to indicate that you are rephrasing something. You're saying, or rather. That's why when I was explaining it, I said it means was being sold, or not was being sold, but rather. We have a lesson on this in NativShark, so I'll just read you the summary. Yeah, right here. Different ways to use teyuka. Teyuka can be used to convey that what you said might not be exactly what you meant. It roughly corresponds to English phrases such as or rather, or perhaps I should say, and so on. Revising a description. First, you can use teyuka when you want to revise the words used for something. The guest house that you and your friend booked for your Kyoto trip advertised itself as a historic establishment. In reality, it was just an old, run-down house.
歴史を感じるっていうか、ボロボロって言った方が正しいよね。
歴史を感じるっていうか、ボロボロって言った方が正しいよね。
Historic? More like shabby. So that teyuka, because we have this phrase right here, 歴史を感じる, literally feel history, and then teyuka. So we're going to rephrase that, and then boroboro. So boroboro means like in tatters or torn up, falling apart. So listen to our sentence again, specifically that part where she says teka.
そこで甘酒とお汁粉が売られてたってか自由に取っていいよってなってて、すごい悩んで甘酒にしたの私は。
Okay. So they were selling. I mean, not selling, but they had amazake and oshiruko. That's that part that we were looking at. You could take for free, and I had such a hard time deciding which one to take, but I decided on amazake. She says urareteta teka because she needs to rephrase that urareteta was being sold. It's not actually what was happening because no one was paying for this stuff. It was free. The other place in this sentence where you might say that she messed up, so to speak, is at the end. She says atashi wa at the very end of the sentence. Atashi is a feminine sounding way to say I, and then wa is a topic marking particle. And I should mention that if you're studying Hiragana still, this is actually the character for ha, but when it's used as a particle, it's pronounced wa, not ha. In most learning materials, you'll see the topic of conversation put at the beginning of a sentence. So you would see something like atashi wa at the beginning. And that is proper, so to speak. But in everyday language, it's very common for a person to be talking and then realize that maybe it's not clear what the topic is of what they're saying. So they just tack it on to the end like she did here, putting 私は at the end of her sentence.
そこで甘酒とお汁粉が売られてたってか自由に取っていいよってなってて、すごい悩んで甘酒にしたの私は。
すごい悩んで甘酒にしたの means something like had such a hard time deciding but went with 甘酒. And then she feels that she needs to clarify that she's talking about herself. So then she tacks on 私は I and then topic marking particle は at the end of that. So I had such a hard time deciding, but I went with 甘酒. So yeah, like I said, just because a sentence is long does not mean that there is some blueprint for it. You can just sort of piece things together as you're talking, and you'll get better at this with time. Let's go back to the beginning of the sentence. She starts with
そこで甘酒とお汁粉が
the first thing she says is そこで. So そこ is there, i.e. at the shrine near her house, which she mentioned in the previous sentence. And then で is a particle that can mark the location at which an action is done. In other words, she's saying で because she's about to tell us what happened while she was there. We've already seen 甘酒とお汁粉, 甘酒 and お汁粉, and then they're followed by the subject marking particle が, which is just to indicate that this is the subject of her sentence. Then the listener throws in another i-adjective saying うわ. Then 売られてたってか. Someday I'll be able to say that. 売られてたってか was being sold, or rather not was being sold. But 自由 means free or freedom. And then if you put the particle に onto the end of it, it turns it into an adverb, so meaning freely. And the verb that is done freely is the verb that comes next, which is 取る. So 自由に取る means to take freely. Only 取る was in the te form, so 取って take and. And by the way, we could have guessed that 取る is a godan verb because the vowel sound before it is o, toru. So that's why we know it's a godan verb. I'm not going to explain why it's conjugated the way it is. I'm just going to point out that it is a godan verb. So 取って is take and after that we have the word I, so which means good or fine. So 取っていい means okay to take, and 自由に取っていい means okay to take freely, you're free to take. And then after that we had よ, which is a particle that can be used for emphasis or to indicate to someone that you're telling them something that they don't know yet. And then that is followed by te again, which is like a quotation marker that marks the phrase that comes before it. So that te is wrapping up, so to speak, the phrase that comes before it. 自由に取っていいよ, okay to take freely. Then なってて, and here again we see the present progressive tense of a verb. So なる usually is translated as to become, and the te form of that is なって, and then the te iru form is なっている, and then if we wanted to put the auxiliary verb also in te form, it's なっていて, and then if we're using spoken language like she is, we can drop that i of the auxiliary verb and say なってて. So literally that's is becoming, which doesn't really make sense. Really, it's just a way of saying that something is in a state of some kind. なってて is becoming, is in this state. And what state are things in? Well, that was marked by our quotation marking particle, right? So 自由に取っていいよってなってて means literally it was in this state of being able to take freely. And we can worry about making that sound more natural when we translate the entire sentence. And then after that, she gets to the heart of the sentence, so to speak. She says, すごい悩んで甘酒にしたの、私は。
すごい悩んで甘酒にしたの、私は。
I had such a hard time deciding which one to take, but I decided on 甘酒. The verb 悩む means something like to be worried about or to be unsure. And she uses this verb because she was unsure about if she should take 甘酒 or お汁粉. And she puts that in te form, so that's why she says 悩んで. And she wasn't just worrying a little bit about which to choose, 甘酒 or お汁粉. She was worrying a lot, and that's why she put the word すごい before it, because すごい means extremely, amazing, very. It means a lot of things. If you wrote すごい悩んで in an essay for your Japanese language class or something, your Japanese teacher would probably mark it wrong because 悩んで is a verb and すごい is an i-adjective, but you should use adverbs to modify verbs, right? So you should change that i-adjective into an adverb. So you would change すごい to すごく, saying すごく悩んで. And that's correct. But in spoken language, it's so common to just say すごい as an adverb like she does here. And that's why she says すごい悩んで. So in short, don't write すごい悩んで in your essay for class, but feel free to say すごい悩んで or すごい whatever if you're saying that you did a verb very much or to an extreme degree. You know, in spoken language, it's fine to do. Anyway, after all that fretting, what did she do? She...
すごい悩んで甘酒にしたの、私は。
甘酒にしたの. I went with amazake. I decided on amazake. We've seen amazake, and I briefly mentioned that no in this sentence is like nda. It's an explanation marker. However, no as an explanation marker often sounds more feminine than nda. This does not mean that you need to say no if you want to sound feminine, and it does not mean that you can't say no if you don't want to sound feminine. It really can depend a lot on the context and even the region of Japan which you're speaking. Now, playing with the nuance of your own speech is something you can look forward to at very advanced levels of Japanese. That said, if you're worried about sounding overly feminine, which I've noticed a lot of male speakers do sound overly feminine when they speak Japanese, maybe try to avoid using no as an explanation marker until you get a sense of when you could use it without sounding particularly feminine, depending on your age and region and everything else. Anyway, this nishita part. So, shita is did, so it's the past tense of the verb suru, to do. And suru is one of those very rare irregular verbs. So shita is an irregular conjugation. But this verb is so common that you'll learn all of its irregular conjugations naturally. And the pattern na ni suru can be used when you're saying that you decide on something or go with something being the noun in that phrase. So she said amazake ni shita. So I decided on amazake, literally amazake ni did. And hey, look at that. We just made it through that entire super long sentence. So listen to it and see how much you understand this time.
なんか年明けて、夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど、そこで甘酒とお汁粉が売られてたっていうか、自由に取っていいよってなってて、すごい悩んで甘酒にしたの、私は。
So, for the start of the new year, I went to the shrine near my house around midnight, and they were selling, not selling, but they had amazake and oshiruko that you could take for free, and I had such a hard time deciding which one to take, but I decided on amazake. That's a long one. I have good news. The next sentence is pretty short.
私も甘酒かも。
So, I might pick amazake too. There are only 4 pieces to this sentence, and we've already seen half of them. So, atashi is a feminine way of saying I, and amazake, as we know, is amazake. And in between those two, we have the particle mo, which in this case you can think of as meaning also or to. So, I also amazake. And then at the end of that, she says kamo, which means something like maybe or might. You can only put this at the end of a clause, by the way, because it's an abbreviation of kamoshirenai. But that's a topic for another video. So I also amazake maybe. So I might choose amazake also. I might pick amazake too.
私も甘酒かも。
And then the first girl said, well, I'm realizing that I should have learned these girls' names before I made this video, but I'm sorry, awesome podcaster girls. I did not learn your names. Anyway, the first girl then says...
でも、なんか母親がお汁粉取ってて、で、一口飲ませてもらったんだけど、ちょっとお汁粉めっちゃうまかった。
Alright, that's pretty long, right? I'll play it one more time.
でも、なんか母親がお汁粉取ってて、で、一口飲ませてもらったんだけど、ちょっとお汁粉めっちゃうまかった。
Okay, but so my mother took oshiruko and I took a sip of it, and well, it was super delicious. These longer sentences don't intimidate us that much anymore, right? Demo means but or however, and we've seen that nanka, literally something, can be used as a sort of filler when you're searching for a word to say. Hahaoya is one of the many possible ways to say mother or mom. There are lots of them. Interestingly, haha, it means mother, and oya means parent. So hahaoya is kind of literally saying mother, parent, but it just means mother. If you were talking to your mom and calling her mom or mother, you would probably say okasan. Take a closer look at this kanji for mother. I've seen people online saying that this kanji came from the kanji for woman, only in the kanji for mother, she's sitting down and then there's 2 little dots to represent the part of the anatomy that a mother gives to a baby. But then I saw a different explanation online that I thought was more convincing that said they just used to be the same character and then they just added 2 dots to distinguish between the 2. These are really old characters, by the way, and I should probably make a video just about their history because it's so cool, but not this video. Anyway, I've mentioned that kanji can have readings or pronunciations and that those can be different. For example, we just saw that this kanji can be pronounced haha in the word haha or hahaoya, which means mother, but it can also be pronounced ka, as in okasan, which also means mother or mom. And this kanji can also be pronounced bo, as in something like bokoku, which is like one's motherland, one's home country, literally mother country, the motherland. Bo is an onyomi, so it's a reading that comes from Chinese. And then haha is a native Japanese reading, so it's kunyomi. And then ka is an irregular reading. Lots of people like to go and look up all the possible readings of a kanji, and then they go and try to learn a word for each reading every time they learn a new kanji. And I think this is not a very good use of your precious study time. For example, if you did that for this kanji, in addition to the readings that I just told you, you would also see that mo is a possible reading of this kanji, kunyomi specifically. But this reading is so rare for this kanji that you wouldn't really need to know it for a very long time in your Japanese studies. And now imagine learning a couple of readings that you really don't even need to know for hundreds or even thousands of kanji. And you can see how that ends up being a pretty poor use of time when you're still at a beginner, intermediate, or even like lower advanced level. Rather than trying to learn all the readings of a particular kanji, you can just learn words containing that kanji when you encounter those words. And then when you do that, you'll probably learn them in sentences, in context, and it'll be much easier to learn to read them. And I have a whole video just about that. But yeah, sorry, I went off on a bit of a tangent there. It's just kanji can be fun to talk about. So the beginning of the sentence was, what was it?
でもなんか母親が
でもなんか母親が So thanks to the subject marking particle ga, we know that mother is the subject of the sentence that is being said here. And what did her mother do? Well, that's what she says after this.
でもなんか母親がおしるこ取ってて、
おしるこ取ってて So she took おしるこ. We have おしるこ and then 取ってて. You might be wondering why there's two te at the end of this verb. So the verb toru means to take, and then the te form of that is totte. And then she's putting the auxiliary verb after that, iru, and that's also in te form. So it would be totte ite, but then she's omitting that i sound because people do that in spoken language so often. So tottete. And the reason that auxiliary verb is included is because she's holding, or she has the oshiruko in her hand after she grabs it. She doesn't just take it, she takes it and then is holding it. And that's because iru is used to describe like a state of some kind. It took me a long time to get a sense for when I should include this auxiliary verb at the end of a verb conjugation in order to indicate that I'm describing being in a state of some kind. And I think I still mess it up sometimes. So yeah, don't worry too much about being a master of whether or not you should be adding this auxiliary verb to the end of your verb conjugations right now. It's something that you'll get used to over time. Notice how often I say that. Then she starts the next sentence with de.
で一口読ませてもらったんだけど、
Wow, that is really hard to catch, right?
で一口読ませてもらったんだけど、
Earlier, I mentioned that the particle de can be used to describe the means by or the location in which an action is done. A different meaning that's sort of related is that de can be used to say something like and then or then. Many of us learners of Japanese, and myself included at one point, have a tendency to say soshite when we want to say and then when we're speaking. And that's not very common in spoken language. Instead, people often just say de, like she does here, like she's going to continue what she's saying. So and then, and she starts it by saying de. And then this next part is like almost impossible to catch. She says, let's zoom in on it.
一口読ませてもらったんだけど、
Wow. Okay. Let's listen to it a few times.
一口読ませてもらったんだけど、一口読ませてもらったんだけど、一口読ませてもらったんだけど。
Okay, at the beginning there, she's saying like i. And then to write this, I wrote like i and then a small tsu, which is to indicate that the vowel sound is getting sort of cut off abruptly from that i sound. So she does that because she's about to say something. Maybe she's going to say like ikko, which means like one thing, but instead she changes her mind and says hitokuchi, which means one sip or one bite. In this case, she's getting a drink, so it's one sip. So hitokuchi is like a sip. I love the kanji for hitokuchi because it's one mouth. So a sip, one mouth, a bite. After hitokuchi, we have nomashite moratta. That part's hard to catch, I thought, the audio there.
一口読ませてもらったんだけど。
There's a lot happening in this verb conjugation, so let's just take a deep breath. Okay. Are you ready? The verb nomu means to drink. The verb morao means to receive. If you put that verb in the past tense, plain past tense, it's moratta, so received. And aside from describing literally receiving something. The verb morao can describe receiving an action of some kind, and that's when you pair it with a verb. So like, for example, if we had the verb nomu here in te form, so that'd be nonde morao is literally drink, receive. And if I said nonde morao, it means I'm going to get you to drink that for me. I'm going to have you drink it. I'm going to get you to drink it. And similarly, if morao was in past tense, moratta, nonde moratta would mean I got you to drink it. I had you drink it. Or whoever, I had him drink it. But she doesn't say nonde moratta because she didn't have her mother drink her mother's oshiruko. Also, it's weird to me that people are drinking oshiruko and not eating it, but whatever. Okay, but she didn't have her mother drink it. She got her mother to let her drink it. And in order to sort of switch the direction this is happening, she could use the causative form of the verb nomu, which is nomaseru, to make or to let someone drink. When students of Japanese are first taught causative form, they would learn that the causative form of nomu, to drink, is nomaseru, to make someone drink or to let someone drink. And that is accurate because it's a godan verb, and you take the final u sound and you change it to an a sound. So nomu becomes no ma, and then you add seru. So nomaseru, to make someone drink or to let someone drink. That's what students are initially taught. But they are all of them deceived. For another conjugation is made. In the land of Japan, in the mouths of native speakers, the people forged in secret another conjugation to be used just as commonly. And it does not end in seru, but in su. That's just my silly way of telling you that a different causative form of nomu is nomasu. So instead of putting seru after that ma sound, you put su, nomasu. And both nomaseru and nomasu mean to make someone drink or to let someone drink. And that's why, and she puts nomasu into te form, which is nomashite. And then she puts moratta onto the end, nomashite moratta. I received her letting me drink. Even to this day, I sometimes mess up this like vite morao pattern. And when I say messed up, I either accidentally do or don't use causative form for the verb that comes at the beginning, depending on if I'm describing me doing the action or someone else doing it. And yeah, I messed it up all the time. Nowadays, I only mess it up every now and then. You will probably mess it up too. Oh, and I have to mention that it's pretty much impossible to catch where she's saying nomashite. And that's okay because you don't need to be able to catch every syllable. Like I mentioned, you just need to be able to infer what she is trying to say. And someone with a sufficiently advanced knowledge of the Japanese language would, from this context and all the words and stuff around it, be able to infer that she's saying nomashite moratta because she's talking about her mom getting oshiruko, whereas she got amazake and she wanted to try her mom's oshiruko. So nomashite just makes sense to say there. And if you slow it down, you can kind of hear that's what she's saying, but it's pretty hard. Like that's crazy fast, right? What do you think? I should put all the way to the moratta part. Huh? Let's try. Let's just see if we can catch it. I can't talk that fast. I have a hard time talking fast in English, even, let alone in Japanese. And by the way, she puts ndakedo at the end of that sentence because, as we covered earlier, she's setting up for something she's going to say after this. Specifically, she continues with... で、一口読ませてもらったんだけど、ちょっとおしるこめっちゃうまかった。マジか。So that next part was... ちょっとおしるこめっちゃうまかった。Right there. Let's stop right there. ちょっとおしるこめっちゃうまかった。マジ。ちょっとおしるこめっちゃうまかった。So, ちょっと means like a little bit, a bit. And if you see that written, it's not... That's a small yo, so it's not chiyo. It's because when you put a small yo after chi, it becomes cho. So, ちょっと. Aside from meaning a little bit or a bit, this can also be used as a kind of filler word, just like it's just taking up space. In our translation, I translated it as well, like, well, it was super delicious, but sometimes you can't translate it all that easily. Oshiruko we know is oshiruko. Meccha is a casual sounding adverb that means something like very, extremely, super. And here it's modifying the word umakatta, which is like was tasty, was delicious. So meccha umakatta means was super delicious, was so good. Umai is an i-adjective that means tasty or delicious. If you want to put that into past tense, you just drop off the final i sound and you replace it with katta. So umai, umakatta. Umakatta is was tasty, was delicious. Earlier when we were talking about sugoi, we saw that to put that into an adverbial form, you drop off the final i and replace it with ku to make sugoku, right? And here we're seeing umai, and we're dropping off the i again, and we're replacing it this time with katta to make umakatta, was tasty. So it's time for a quiz for you. What if we wanted to say was amazing? How would we change the i-adjective sugoi? Well, we drop the final i and replace it with katta. So sugoi, sugokatta, was amazing, was great, was impressive, sugokatta. But we could put that whole sentence together now and listen to it. Let's try.
でもなんか母親がお汁粉取ってて、で一口読ませてもらったんだけど、ちょっとお汁粉めっちゃうまかった。マジか。
So you can hear the listener inserting aizuchi, you know, those sounds that you make to indicate that you're listening, a few times, just in that one sentence alone. She says, like, yeah, 3 times, I think. And then at the end, she says, majika, which means like, seriously, but I'll get to that in a second. So let's listen for all the aizuchi. So.
でもなんか母親がお汁粉取ってて、で一口読ませてもらったんだけど、ちょっとお汁粉めっちゃうまかった。マジか。
Maji is a slang-like abbreviation of the word majime, which means serious or earnest. And then ka is a question marking particle. So in a literal sense, she's saying seriously. And I almost translated it as seriously. And I was thinking of maybe putting you're kidding me instead. And then I was talking with today, my wife, and we went back and forth a little bit. And in the end, we decided to translate this majika as no, with like 3 or 4 O's in it. I think no is a good translation of this usage of majika here, especially because she sort of like exhales when she says it. Listen for how she says it at the end of this sentence.
でもなんか母親がお汁粉取ってて、で一口読ませてもらったんだけど、ちょっとお汁粉めっちゃうまかった。マジか。
マジか。Man, I don't know why, but this kind of stuff is really fun for me. I just love studying Japanese. Majika. I'm gonna hear her say it again.
Majika.
Majika. You know, I think we can divide this entire 1 minute and 40-second conversation into 3 parts. And we've only got 1 sentence left in part 1. That sentence is...
なんかあれお汁粉にすればよかったかなって一瞬思ったね。
And like for a second I thought, what? I should have gotten oshiruko. They're talking over each other a bit here, so don't worry if you couldn't catch some parts. Again, she says de at the beginning to indicate that she still has more to say. So maybe like so or and then is what we would say in English. And again, she says nanka while sort of searching for her words. This is kind of a quirk that this person has to their Japanese, that they say nanka a lot. Not all native speakers would say that word so commonly. And at the very end of this sentence, she says te isshin omotta. So the verb omo means to think, and the past tense is omotta, so thought. And then isshin means a moment, an instant. So isshin omotta is I thought for a moment, I thought for a second. And what did she think for a second? Well, that part is marked, so to speak, by the quotation marker de. So we have to look at what comes before de to see what it was that she thought for a second.
あれお汁粉にすればよかったかなって一瞬思った。
あれお汁粉にすればよかったかな? What? I should have gotten oshiruko. In another context, the word are can mean that over there, like that thing that's close to neither you nor me. Or like it's used here, it can mean something like huh or what. Sometimes you'll see someone get confused and be like, are? Like what, huh? So that's the word she's using here. And after she says that, she says,
お汁粉にすればよかったか。
お汁粉にすればよかった. So oshiruko is oshiruko. Remember when we saw amazake ni shita no? I went with amazake. We saw that when you put noun ni suru, you can describe going with something or deciding on something. And that's the same pattern being used here. Only instead of amazake, she says oshiruko. And instead of nishita, she's saying nisureba. So ni is the same, right? It's the particle. And then the verb suru is in this case in the conditional form. So instead of suru, it's sureba. So if I do, if I did, put those together, and oshiruko ni sureba means if I had gone with oshiruko. There are a few conditional forms in Japanese. Like earlier we saw the tara conditional in the word dattara, if it were. I think the sentence was amazake to oshiruko dattara dochi ga suki? So dattara if it were. If you put the verb suru, to do, into the tara conditional form, it would be shitara. But instead she's using the ba conditional form, which is sureba. And there are other conditional forms too. And for much of your Japanese learning journey, you're going to find yourself wondering, why did they use this conditional form and not that one? Because I would have thought you would use that one here and not this one. Especially when you're deciding between ba and tara conditionals. There have been a few times when I've used one and then a native speaker corrected me and told me to use the other one, and I've just been completely lost as to why. But why don't we just confuse ourselves for a second and go deep on these conditionals? We saw that the tara conditional form of the copula can be tattara if it were. The ba conditional of the copula could be either nara, which you can just learn as a unique word, or it could be deareba, which is pretty stiff sounding, like something you'd encounter in writing. It would actually be fine to say, amazake to oshiruko nara, dochi ga suki? So which do you like better, amazake or oshiruko? Saying nara instead of dattara, that would be fine. And some native speakers might actually choose to say that question in that way. But it would be super strange to say deareba there. Amazake to oshiruko deareba, dochi ga suki? It's really weird sounding. So the question then is, could we change the ba conditional in this sentence, this oshiruko ni sureba yokatta phrase? Could we instead say oshiruko ni shitara yokatta? And the answer is yes, but it would not be that common. In particular, because this ba yokatta means was good, and this ba yokatta pattern is often used when you're saying I should have done something or I wish I had done something. Yokatta is the past tense, by the way, of both yoi and i, both of which mean good. It makes sense if it's yoi, right? Because you just drop the final i and replace it with kata. So yoi, yokatta was good. And then i is just an irregular conjugation. So i is good and yokatta is was good. And you put yokatta onto a ba conditional conjugation to say it would have been good if whatever. So oshiruko ni sureba yokatta, literally oshiruko, if I went with, was good. So it means I should have gone with oshiruko. And yeah, you could say oshiruko ni shitara yokatta, saying shitara instead of sureba, so the tara conditional, but just most native speakers wouldn't. And I'm not trying to say all of this to confuse you. I'm just trying to say it so that you know that while it's fine for us to, dive deep and to try to analyze why we would say one thing or not another, eventually we just need to get a feel for it the way that native speakers do. And we would just know to say one or the other based on the thousands and thousands of times that we've heard other people say it in that kind of situation. And then you start to pick up on little things. For example, you start to notice that the ba conditional is typically the one used when you're talking about some kind of hypothetical outcome that would have been desirable or pleasant. An outcome like choosing oshiruko at a New Year's shrine visit because it tasted good. No educational material is going to be able to identify every little nuance like this for you, although we do really try hard to do so at NativShark. We're not going to get all of them. And that's okay, because discovering these out in the world as you interact with the Japanese that interest you is going to be a big and fun part of your studies. When you run into something you don't totally understand, it's not an evidence that you're somehow failing to learn Japanese or that you failed in this moment. It's just a clue in a mystery that has yet to be solved. So even if you see something that confuses you and you try to look up an answer for it, and even the answer is confusing a little bit, you can just tuck that away into the file. And someday later, when you've gathered more evidence about this language, you'll be able to crack the case of why that is or is not used. Anyway, the full quoted thought was, "Are oshiruko ni sureba yokatta kana?" And so that kana at the end indicates that she's wondering something aloud. Kana can often be translated as I wonder. And I think we've got the whole sentence now. So that's...
なんかあれおしるこにすればよかったかなって一瞬思ったね。
And like for a second I thought, what? I should have gotten oshiruko. Well, we're not totally done with this sentence because I forgot to mention the particle ne at the end, which means something like, huh, or right? So like we saw, sugoi is amazing. You could say, sugoi ne, like it's amazing, huh? It's so good, huh? Or we saw umai, and you could have someone try some food that you think is great, and they try it, and you could say, umai yo ne. So umai, tasty, yo is emphasis particle, ne is confirmation seeking particle. So it's good, huh? It's so good, right? That ne is used much more often in Japanese than we say things like huh or right in English, way more. And so sometimes it's hard to translate Japanese because you don't know if you should explicitly translate the ne or not, because if you translate it every time, the English starts to sound a little weird. And if you never translate it, it feels like you're kind of missing some of the nuance to the Japanese. But yeah, the joys of translation. Okay, we just finished part 1 of 3 of this 1 minute and 40-second conversation. I'll play it again. I'll play this whole part again and see how much you understand now. Try to do the same thing you did when you first watched the clip. So like if you were just listening, try to just listen. If you were reading just the Japanese transcription, try to do that. And if you were just listening while you read along with the English, try to do that as well. And just notice how much you do or do not catch compared to the first time that you heard this. Let's do it.
甘酒とおしるこだったらどっちが好き？
うわ、究極の択や。
なんか 年明けて、夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど、そこで甘酒とお汁粉が売られてたってか、自由に取っていいよってなってて、すごい悩んで甘酒にしたの、私は。
甘酒かも。
でもなんか母親がお汁粉取ってて、で一口飲ませてもらったんだけど、ちょっとお汁粉めっちゃうまかった。
マジか。
でなんかあれお汁粉にすればよかったかなって一瞬思ったね。
なんか
In part 2 of the conversation, the topic turns to mochi. You know, those soft and chewy, gooey rice cakes in Japan? The reason they start talking about mochi is that there's mochi in oshiruko. So she says,
なんかどっちが好き？焼いてある餅を入れるお汁粉と、溶けそうな餅が入ってるお汁粉。
なんかどっちが好き？焼いてある餅を入れるお汁粉と溶けそうな餅が入ってるお汁粉。So which do you like better? Oshiruko with grilled mochi or with gooey mochi? You can see the word mochi twice in this sentence. First she says yaite aru mochi, so grilled mochi. And then she says tokesou na mochi. Mochi that is about to dissolve is kind of what it means. So that's something like mochi that seems like it will melt or dissolve. We'll talk about that more in a second. So there are a few traditional Japanese dishes where mochi is in a kind of like soup. And the consistency of the mochi in that soup can depend on how it is cooked. For example, sometimes maybe on a menu or a picture on a website of a restaurant, you'll see a picture of a soup with mochi in it, and someone will be picking it up with chopsticks, and it sort of like is dripping down the chopsticks because it's melty mochi. That's what she's talking about when she says tokesou na mochi. The verb tokeru means to melt or to dissolve, and the so ending that can attach to the ma stem of verbs is used when you want to say that something seems like it's going to verb or looks like it's about to verb. I won't get into all the conjugation rules, but for ichidan verbs like tokeru, to melt, is an ichidan verb. You just drop the ru and replace it with so. So tokeru, toke and that means something like seems like it's going to melt or is about to melt or dissolve. And when you have so onto the end of a verb like this, that verb can then be used as an adjective if you'd like. So not an i-adjective like we saw with umai, tasty, or sugoi, amazing. This acts as a na-adjective. So in her sentence, she said tokesou na mochi. And that na at the end is because this is acting as a na-adjective. And it's modifying the noun mochi. So tokesou na mochi is mochi that looks like it's about to dissolve or melt. Yeah, so i-adjectives are ones that end in i. And then na-adjectives are ones where you put na in between the adjective and the noun. So just saying tokesou mochi without the na sounds really weird. So you have to insert na, tokesou na mochi. Melty mochi. Mochi that seems like it's going to dissolve. If the phrase tokesou mochi doesn't sound weird to you yet, that just means you haven't had enough exposure to Japanese. Once you get enough exposure to natural Japanese, you'll start to feel that like something's a little off sometimes when you are either saying something or hearing something. This happens to me a lot when I'm talking and I don't have time to think about what I'm saying and I'm thinking, oh, what am I saying? But yeah, you'll get that feeling too in time. The other type of mochi she mentions is yaite aru mochi. So I translated that as grilled mochi. So if you bake or grill, like cook mochi, it can get kind of hard and firm and it's not melty. It's more like a solid thing you can take a bite out of. The verb yaku means a lot of things like to grill, to roast, to bake, to toast, to cook with fire, basically. And she puts that verb into te form. So yaite, grill, and then she adds aru to the end of that. And aru in other contexts could mean have or there is, but that's not what it means here. Earlier, we saw that iru can be an auxiliary verb. It attaches to the end of other verbs and puts them into other tenses like present progressive. And iru on its own also can mean there is or have, just like aru. The difference is that iru is typically used for animate things, like things that are alive, like a person or an animal. And then aru would be used for things that are not alive, inanimate objects, like a desk or a pen. But both of these verbs are common enough that you're going to hear them over and over again, and you'll learn when to use which one without thinking too much about whether something's alive or not. So earlier we saw vite iru is used when you're describing something that's in a particular state, an ongoing state. And again, very similarly, vite aru is describing something that's in a state, but specifically it's describing something that has been put into a particular state. For example, yaite iru mochi would be mochi that's being grilled right now. It is grilling. Whereas yaite aru mochi is mochi that has been grilled. It has been put into the state of having been grilled. And that's what she says with the noun phrase yaite aru mochi. In noun phrases in Japanese, by the way, the noun appears at the end of the phrase, and then the details of that noun phrase come before the noun. That's why mochi is the very last part of yaite aru mochi, mochi that has been grilled. You notice it's opposite in English sometimes. So mochi that has been grilled, mochi is at the front of that phrase, whereas yaite aru mochi, mochi is at the end. Anyway, this sentence is a great example of how culture is so important when learning Japanese, because in the US, for example, maybe you've had mochi, but maybe you've only had it like in mochi ice cream, in which case it's pretty chewy and hard. Maybe you've never had it in a soup, or maybe you've only had it in a soup where it was tokeso na mochi and it was kind of that stretching out, melty mochi, or maybe you've only had it when it was yaite aru mochi and it was like that grilled or roasted, baked mochi that's kind of hard and firm. If you haven't had both, then even if you know all the words that this person is saying, you wouldn't really understand what they're talking about. That's why cultural information is so helpful. Okay, let's go back and get our bearings again. The whole sentence is...
なんか、どっちが好き？焼いてある餅を入れるお汁粉と、溶けそうな餅が入ってるお汁粉。
So, which do you like better? Oshiruko with grilled mochi or gooey mochi? By the way, did you understand that entire first sentence that she said? Because we've seen all the parts. She starts with nanka, like or so. Then dochi is which. Specifically, dochi is which of two options. Then we had ka, the subject marking particle, pointer particle, identifier particle. It's identifying dochi as the thing. And ski, it's like liking, favored. So, nanka, dochi ga suki? So, which do you like better? And then she clarifies what she means by which do you like better. She specifically tells her the two options of the two types of mochi. So,
なんか、どっちが好き？焼いてある餅を入れるお汁粉と、溶けそうな餅が入ってるお汁粉。
焼いてある餅を入れるお汁粉と、溶けそうな餅が入ってるお汁粉。お汁粉 with grilled mochi or gooey mochi? Literally, that's grilled mochi o insert oshiruko and melty mochi ga is containing oshiruko. Did you notice that the two verbs she uses, ireru, to insert, to put in, and hairu, to enter, to go in, contain the same kanji? These two verbs are kind of the same verb, only ireru is a transitive verb, and a transitive verb is a verb that takes an object. That's why the object marking particle o is coming before it. So o ireru. And then hairu is an intransitive verb, so a verb that does not take an object. And that's why the particle ga is coming before it. Many, many, many years ago, when I was teaching English in Tokyo, I would sometimes be talking to a student of English, and I would perhaps tell them what I did over the weekend or what my plans were for the upcoming weekend. And they would say things to me like, "Did you enjoy?" or "I hope you enjoy." These sentences are kind of weird, right? Did I enjoy what? You hope I enjoy what? It sounds weird because to enjoy is a transitive verb in English. We need an object to go with it. Did you enjoy your weekend? I hope you enjoy your trip. Were you able to enjoy yourself? Even when we omit the object, it's inferred. So like if you're a server at a restaurant and you drop off a pizza at the table, you might say, "Here's your pizza, enjoy." The inferred object is it, or maybe yourself. Enjoy it, enjoy yourselves, whatever. A minute ago, we talked about the verb tokeru, to melt, to dissolve. This is an intransitive verb, so it does not need an object. So we could have a sentence like, for example, yuki ga toketa, snow ga melted, the snow melted. There's no object in this sentence. There's only the subject, snow, and it's melting all by itself. But say I poured hot water on the snow. That is, I melted the snow. And in English, snow would be the object of the verb melt in that sentence, because to melt can be either transitive or intransitive in English. But in Japanese, if we wanted to talk about melting something and have it be transitive, we would need to change the verb. So instead of tokeru, to melt, we would use something like tokasu, and that's a transitive verb. So to melt something, to dissolve something. Yuki o tokashita, I melted the snow. And see, we have o in that sentence. There's a reason I'm telling you this. So let's look at this phrase again. She says,
なんか、どっちが好き？焼いてある餅を入れるお汁粉と、溶けそうな餅が入ってるお汁粉。
Oshiruko with grilled mochi or gooey mochi. 焼いてある餅を入れるお汁粉と溶けそうな餅が入ってるお汁粉. She didn't really have to, but for whatever reason, she used both the transitive verb ireru, to insert, to put in, and the intransitive verb hairu, to enter, to go into. There's no need to overthink it. Japanese sentences you encounter in the real world are just messy and all over the place. That said, I do have a fun theory about why she switches between the two versions of this verb. 焼いてある餅を入れる, to insert or put in grilled mochi, And then 溶けそうな餅が入ってる. So literally melty, gooey mochi ga is entering, but more naturally just contains or is containing gooey mochi. Hairu is to enter or to go into, and then she's putting that into te form. So haite, enter, and then she adds the auxiliary verb iru. So haite iru is entering, so it contains. It's the state that's ongoing is containing this. It contains. Only she drops the I of iru, so haiteru. And both of these phrases are modifying the noun oshiruko in the two places that they appear. And as we've seen with noun phrases like yaite aru mochi, the noun in the noun phrase comes at the end. That's why oshiruko is coming after these phrases. And if you're at all like me, maybe you find yourself thinking, why did she switch from the transitive ireru to the intransitive hairu in this one sentence? And she probably didn't even really notice she was doing it, but I have a theory as to why she did. One could argue that with grilled mochi, it's grilled, and then you insert it, put it into the soup. Whereas with tokeso na mochi, like mochi that's melty or gooey, it's not like you ireru mochi after it's already melty gooey. You put in the mochi and then it becomes melty gooey. So after that, tokeso na mochi ga haiteru. There is melty mochi in it. It contains melty mochi. One last thing I want to mention about this sentence is, did you notice that she sort of tripped over her words? Right at this part, she says mochi o ireru oshiruko, which is kind of hard to say fast, right? Mochi o ireru oshiruko.
なんかどっちが好き焼いてある餅を入れるお汁粉とどっちが好き焼いてある餅を入れるお汁粉とどっちが好き焼いてある餅を入れるお汁粉と
She gets kind of tripped up and has to say the o part of oshiruko twice in mochi o ireru oshiruko. Mochi o ireru oshiruko, mochi o ireru oshiruko, mochi o ireru oshiruko. I mean, you and I are probably going to trip over our words much more often than a native speaker does, but it's still nice to know that they trip over their words too. Anyway, the other girl answers with
私もこれは圧倒的に溶けそうな餅。
By far, I prefer gooey mochi. So, 私もこれ圧倒的に溶けそうなお餅. It's kind of hard to hear because they're talking over one another, but at the end of this sentence, she says omochi, putting o in front of the mochi, right here.
私もこれは圧倒的に溶けそうな餅。
Yeah, she said.
溶けそうな餅。
Yeah, she says omochi, not just mochi. So, o is an honorific prefix. In other places, we've heard them say mochi without the honorific prefix. So we've heard both mochi and omochi. Whereas with oshiruko, we've never heard them say just shiruko, although technically they could just say shiruko. They say oshiruko every time. Many, many, many times over the years, I've wondered if I should include an honorific prefix for a word. So is it usually included for this word? Always? Is it just a matter of personal preference? Is there some sort of hidden rule that I need to know about when to insert it or not? These are questions that don't really ever get answered, and you just kind of develop your own sense for when to use them or not over time. Just don't worry about it too much. Anyway, she starts her sentence with atashi, I, feminine, and then she says mo, and mo can mean a few things. The first meaning people usually encounter is already, as in, for example, mo ireta, like already inserted, I already put it in, or mo nonda, I already drank it, already, and then drink. But the usage here, when she says atashi mo, is different. We have a short lesson on this in NativShark, so let's just check it out. Using mo to strengthen an expression. Aside from literally meaning already or another, mo can be used to emphasize the strength of an emotion, decision, etc. In turn, it can be used as a standalone interjection expressing frustration. A delivery man rings the doorbell just as you were stepping into the shower. You get the package and undress again, but the doorbell rings a second time. Seriously? We put jeez.
私もこれは圧倒的に溶けそうな餅。
And the reason she includes mo in her sentence here is that she is emphatically in favor of gooey mochi.
私もこれは圧倒的に溶けそうな餅。
私もこれは圧倒的に溶けそうな餅. In fact, she even further emphasizes that she's heavily in favor of gooey, melty mochi because she uses the word 圧倒的に, overwhelmingly. So 圧倒的 is a na-adjective meaning overwhelming. And then she makes it into an adverb by putting ni after it. 圧倒的に, overwhelmingly. And right before that, she says これは. Kore means this. In this case, it means, this topic, debate of which is better, grilled or gooey mochi. And then she says wa, the topic marking particle. Sometimes it can help to think of wa as meaning something like when it comes to or as for. So in a quasi-literal translation, we could say that this sentence, this
私もこれは圧倒的に溶けそうな餅。
something like, in my case, well, when it comes to this question, I am overwhelmingly for melty mochi. The translation I actually wrote is by far I prefer gooey mochi. You might be thinking that this English translation is not as emphatic as the Japanese, which has both that mo and that attotekki ni. And yeah, maybe that's right, but in English we might stress our words. Like, by far, I prefer guimochi because word stress is very important in English and not quite as much in Japanese. And in response to her being overwhelmingly in favor of gui mochi, we hear that the other girl agrees. She says,
私も溶けそう。
Atashi mo tokeso. I, feminine, mo means also, tokeso, about to melt, dissolve. Seems like it'll melt, dissolve. But we could just translate that whole thing, Atashi mo tokeso, as me too. In other words, they are both in the melty mochi camp. And I think I agree, particularly if it's mochi in like a soup dish of some kind. But when I'm eating it like that, I do tend to take bigger bites, and I'm a little bit worried that I'm going to choke on it because lots of people are rushed to the hospital every year around New Year's in Japan because they are choking on mochi from dishes like these. And unfortunately, some of them die every year. So be careful out there eating your mochi. And you especially got to watch out if in the cases of elderly people or small children who are most at risk of choking. Then we have
やっぱり
yappari. So I know, right? In some contexts, can mean yes or yeah, but there's not many cases in which you want to say to mean yes or yeah in everyday language. Usually you would just say hi, yes, or yeah. Here though, she isn't saying to mean yes. She's saying it to just mean like oh or ah. And then she says yappari, which in this case means something like as expected or as I thought. Sure enough. I just translated the whole phrase as I know, right? Like, of course you would agree with me because melty mochi is just better, right? Then we have
めちゃくちゃ美味しいよね。白いね。
めちゃくちゃ美味しいよね。白いね. It's so good. It's white. We saw earlier that めっちゃ means something like extremely or very in the phrase ちょっとおしるこめっちゃうまかった. The おしるこ was super tasty. めっちゃ is actually an abbreviation of めちゃくちゃ, so they can mean the same thing, extremely or very. And here, instead of the i-adjective うまい, which means tasty or delicious, she says おいしい, which is another i-adjective that can mean tasty or delicious. These words can both be written with the same kanji, by the way. Beautiful and taste, flavor. うまい, おいしい. In both cases, these are irregular readings of these kanji, but they're pretty common words, so you just learn to read them by seeing them. So you see those two characters next to each other, and if there's an i after them, you just know it's うまい, and if there's a shi-i after them, you know it's おいしい. They're both commonly written just in Hiragana also, うまい, おいしい. And in the case of うまい, it's also very common to see it written either partially or fully in katakana. うまい, うまい. Is that the first time I mentioned katakana? So there's hiragana, which represents all the sounds in the language, right? And then katakana does the same thing, only they're different characters, and they tend to be used in slightly different ways. Particularly, katakana is often used for foreign loan words, or to add emphasis, or for some other things. So if you really want to put some oomph onto your umai, you might write it all or partially in katakana. And the reason that sometimes the i part is in hiragana, even though the u and ma are in katakana, is that the i part is the conjugatable part of the i-adjective, and it's very common to write conjugatable pieces of Japanese in hiragana. That said, you might see it all in katakana. Umai, umai. If we chose to write umai with katakana, it just gives more of an emphasis on something being very tasty. It also comes off as more colloquial and slang-like. So yeah, katakana can give off this nuance of being sort of in your face. And then also for loan words, like if you wrote camera in Japanese, you write kamera in katakana. Kamera. Is that how you say that? It's written in that because it's adopted from another language. Anyway, that was a tangent. She says,
めちゃくちゃ美味しいよね。白いね。
めちゃくちゃ美味しいよね。白いね. It's so good. It's white. Yo is a particle that can add emphasis. Ne is a particle that's said to seek agreement. And we can hear the listener using aizuchi. She says, to indicate that she's actively listening. Here, right here.
めちゃくちゃ美味しいよね。白いね。
And then the speaker says, 白いね. So white, ne. When I was first writing notes on this conversation, I was wondering, why did she say it's white here? Is it because melty gooey mochi is more white than a baked or grilled one, which would be more like a darker color? And I asked Bae, my wife, and she said, I think she's just saying whatever comes into her head and not thinking about it. So I think I'm just overthinking it. Yeah, it's white. And I like that after she says that, shiroine, it's just white, they sort of just take a moment to daydream together about melty mochi.
めちゃくちゃ美味しいよね。白いね。
トロトロの餅。あれが最高だ。トロトロの餅。あれが最高だ。
That melty, gooey mochi is the best. Toro no omochi. Toro no. Ariga saiko. Yeah. They're just having a good time imagining that melty, gooey mochi goodness. torotoro is an onomatopoeic word. More specifically, it's an idiophone. I have a video on those if you're interested. But yeah, it means melty or gooey, syrupy. Onomatopoeic words, or just words that are sound symbolism in Japanese, are often written in katakana, and that's why we wrote it in katakana here. Toro, toro. So torotoro no omochi is melty, gooey, syrupy mochi. I don't know if this is actually the case, but I've always imagined that this word torotoro comes from or is related to the verb torokeru. And torokeru means to melt, kind of like the verb tokeru that we saw earlier, only this one has that ro in there, so it's not tokeru, which is to melt or to dissolve. It's torokeru, to melt. These two verbs are not used interchangeably. Tokeru would usually be used for something that melts or dissolves completely, like 100%. It's gone. You put sugar and water and it will tokeru. It'll melt, dissolve completely. Torokeru, on the other hand, describes something getting like melty or gooey when you melt it, like cheese. If you go to a supermarket in Japan, you'll see that they sell these packages that say torokeru cheese on them, like cheese for melting, cheese that melts. And you'll notice that because cheese is a foreign loan word, it's written in katakana, chi, and then that horizontal bar is to indicate that we elongate the vowel sound coming before it, so that i and chi, so chi, i, and then zu, cheese, cheese. I was thinking about this, and then if tokeru is the one that melts or dissolves completely, and torokeru is the one that gets like gooey or melty, why did they say tokeso na mochi in the sentence earlier? Which would, because tokeru is the one that melts or dissolves completely. Well, she didn't say toketa mochi, because toketa is the past tense of tokeru. So if it was toketa mochi, then that would mean that it melted or dissolved completely. It's gone. There's nothing left to grab with your chopsticks. But instead she said tokeso na mochi, so it seems like or looks like it's about to melt. So maybe that's why she said it. Although she could have also said now I'm getting them mixed up. She also could have said torokeso na mochi, which would have been fine too. So yeah, either way. Anyway, let's hear them say it again.
トロトロの餅。あれが最高だ。
Are, like we said, means that over there. So she's thinking about that melty mochi over there in her mind. And then ga is subject marking particle because are is the subject. And then she says saiko, which is the best, the greatest. And there's like this, we put this squiggly line after it, and that's because she kind of draws out that final o sound. Saiko. Let's hear her say it. She says
トロトロの餅。あれが最高だ。あれが最高だ。
are ga saiko. We also could have written a flat horizontal line, and that would have been fine too. I have to admit, so many times over the years, I've transcribed some Japanese, and I've either transcribed a word like this with a flat horizontal line or with a wavy one, and then Rei, my wife, will be checking it and she'll switch it to the other one, and then I'll feel like maybe I chose the wrong one. But really, it's just a matter of personal preference and what you feel like matches what that person is saying. I'll be honest, I'm still trying to develop a feel for when to write which one when I'm transcribing Japanese. Although luckily, transcribing Japanese is not something that you need to do very often, unless you're me. Anyway, did you hear the other girl? She said, yeah. So yeah means no, but here it just means something like, like, it is an interjection to indicate your feelings. And her feeling is that torotoro no omochi is just, so good. That is omochi, that is torotoro. And we have no connecting those two words. So torotoro no omochi, mochi that is torotoro is just so good. Okay, next sentence.
餅はね、やっぱね、とろけそうなやつの方が好きなんだよね。
Yeah, you know, for mochi, I prefer it to just be all melty. Like, we've seen most of the parts of this sentence already. We saw omochi, mochi, wa, topic marking particle, ne, confirmation seeking particle. Then yappa is just an abbreviation of yappari, which we saw earlier, means as expected or sure enough, as I thought. Maybe here we'd translate it as after all. Ne, again. Torokeso seems like it will melt, is about to melt. Na is for connecting a na-adjective to a noun. Yatsu is a casual sounding word that means thing. No hoga, which I'll come back to in a second. Ski, liking. Then nanda. And this is that nda of explanation that we saw a few times now. Only it has to have that na at the beginning before nda because it's following a na-adjective because ski is a na-adjective. So ski nanda. Then yo is an emphasis marking particle. And then ne seeks confirmation. And we have gone through a lot of Japanese already. Now that torokiso no yatsu no hoga part. Torokiso no yatsu no hoga. Yeah, I said it right, I think. So ho means something like way or direction. So imagine I'm gesturing in a direction like this. And which direction is this? It's torokiso no yatsu no ho. It's the direction of the melty like mochi. It's not this other direction, this other hole, which would be maybe 焼いてあるやつの方, the grilled mochi direction. Ga is a subject marking particle, although I think you can just memorize no ga as a set phrase that's used when you're talking about one direction, one option among a selection of options, and then maybe you're talking about which one is preferred or bigger or whatever. An option that is separate from the others, no ga. Like, do you remember that I told you we could have a sentence like 犬と猫だったらどっちが好き? Which do you prefer, dogs or cats? 犬と猫だったらどっちが好き? There are a lot of ways you could answer this question. You could just say 犬 dogs, or you could say 猫が好き I like cats. Or you could say 犬の方が好き I prefer dogs, and the implication is over cats. Or you could say 犬より猫の方が好き I prefer cats over dogs. And if you're in a Japanese classroom, I'm guessing they will probably tell you to say something like that last option, only with des at the end, because it's more formal. 私は猫より犬の方が好きです. I wa cats more than dogs no direction side ga liking des. And yeah, that's cool, but good luck finding situations in the real world where you will need to use a fully formed, beautifully structured grammatical sentence like this in everyday speech. Anyway, our sentence was
餅はね、やっぱね、とろけそうなやつの方が好きなんだよね。
And I translated it as, yeah, you know, for mochi, I just prefer it to be all melty like. And then the other girl says,
そうなんだよね。
そうなんだよね, which I translated as just totally. So is hard to translate. It means something like thus or that way, in that way. The way it's used here is just to show that you're agreeing with what someone is saying. Actually, sometimes you'll hear people repeat it. They'll say so, if they're like really agreeing with something that's being said. But she doesn't say so. She says そうなんだよね. And, you know, we could try to figure out, like, why does she have this enough explanation and this yone? Like, what is she emphasizing? What is she seeking confirmation for? And I think that'd be overthinking it. You can just memorize そうなんだよね as a set phrase when you're agreeing with what someone is saying. And there are a lot of variations that contain the word so that you use when you're responding to someone, and in particular when you're agreeing with what they're saying. And at some point, you're probably going to choose one that does not have the intended nuance, and it'll be a little bit off sounding, but don't worry. Over time, with enough exposure to Japanese, you will get a sense for when to use which response with so. And here, this native speaker happens to think that そうなんだよね fits as a response. Next sentence.
でも、硬い餅の方が、なんかこう、食べ損ねても長く食べれる感じはあるよね。
I cannot translate this sentence. I'm sorry. I mean, I'll try. After a lot of back and forth with today, we decided to translate it as, but with hard mochi, like, well, even if you can't eat as much of it, well, it feels like it lasts longer, you know? I'll explain why I'm having trouble translating this sentence in a minute, but first, let's get the straightforward parts out of the way. Demo is but or however. Katai is hard, so katai mochi is hard mochi. You know, like yaite aru mochi, grilled mochi is katai mochi, hard mochi. We just saw how nohoga can be used to indicate one of two options. In this case, it's being used to indicate something about katai mochi nohoga, as opposed to soft melting gooey mochi. Ya is aizuchi from the listener to indicate that she's actively listening. Nanka is a filler that can be used when you're trying to find the right words to say. And ko is also a filler that's used in this way, although it's got more of a nuance that you're trying to pin down something that's difficult to phrase the way you want. I urge you to get good at saying なんかこう the way that she does here. I'll play it for you.
でも、硬い餅の方が、なんかこう、
Right there.
なんかこう、
なんかこう, and the reason I urge you to get good at saying that is because you're going to have a lot of cases where you are trying to buy time while you figure out how to formulate what you want to say in this language. なんかこう. And after that, she says 食べ損ねても, which is the troublesome part here. So I'll come back to that. And then 長く食べれる. So 食べる means to eat. And the potential form of it is 食べられる. So it's an ichidan verb. So you just drop off that final ru and replace it with られる. 食べる to eat. 食べられる to be able to eat. But you'll notice that she doesn't say 食べられる. She says 食べれる. It's hard to catch, but I'll play it.
食べ損ねても長く食べれる感じ。食べ損ねても長く食べれる感じは。
Yeah, she says 食べれる. So it's because in spoken language, people often drop that ra in られる in the potential form and just say れる. So you could say 食べられる or 食べれる, and they both mean to be able to eat. Nagai means long, only she said nagaku, which is the adverbial form of this i-adjective. So nagai, and you drop off that final i, and then you replace it with ku, nagaku, and that makes it an adverb, which maybe we could say means for a long time. So 長く食べれる means to be able to eat for a long time. This is part of a noun phrase ending in the word kanji, feeling. So 長く食べれる kanji is feeling that you can eat for a long time. ある, there is, よね, right? The issue, like I said, is the 食べ損ねても. The verb 食べる means to eat, and this 損ねる part, I'll show you a NativShark lesson on it because that'll be more straightforward. How to use 損なう and 損ねる. Both 損なう and 損ねる mean something like to harm, to damage, to mar. When attached to the ma stem of a verb, they mean to fail to do something or to miss one's chance to do something. Let's scroll down and look at one of the examples of 損ねる attaching to the stem of a verb. A novel. The narrator contracted the flu and now it has worsened.
そういえば今年はワクチンを受け損ねていた。
そういえば今年はワクチンを受け損ねていた。
Now that I think about it, I missed getting the flu shot this year. Ukeru means to receive or to undergo, and the stem of that is uke, so you just drop off that ru because it's an ichidan verb, and then you attach sokoneru to that, so uke sokoneru is to fail to receive, to miss receiving. Only here it's in the past progressive tense, so vite ita, uke sokonete ita, had failed to receive. In the sentence we're studying, we have tabe sokoneru, to fail to eat, only it has the temo ending, which can mean something like even if you do something. So tabe sokonete mo means even if you fail to eat. And the full sentence she's saying is tabe sokonete mo nagaku tabereru kanji aru. Even if you fail to eat it, it feels like you can eat it for a long time. Which I guess is a fine translation, except for one problem, which is that I don't know what that means. Why does failing to eat it mean you feel like you can eat it a long time? And why is that specific to hard mochi and not soft gooey mochi? Is it because mochi will get harder when it cools down? So if you don't eat it all right away, the hard mochi is still hard, but the soft gooey mochi stops being soft and gooey and yummy? And then I was talking to Rei and she said, well, maybe it's because you can't eat a hard mochi as fast or something, or because it requires more chewing. We don't know. But yeah, the translation we went with was, but with hard mochi, like, well, even if you can't eat as much of it, well, like it feels like it'll last longer, you know?
でも、硬い餅の方が、なんかこう食べ損ねても長く食べれる感じはあるよね。
Our translation was only increased with the sentence that follows.
ああ、餅がいい。餅だけに。
餅だけに餅がいいので食べられる感じはある。
Oh, like the mochis for longer? Yeah, if you something, you can still eat it. It mochis well? The mochis so well that it feels like you can eat it longer. I'm really sad. Do you see the question marks in both our transcription and the translation? That part, she clarifies what she meant in the previous sentence, but we can't hear her because they're talking over one another. This something, chatte mo, tabereru. Even if you do something, yeah, you can eat it. If only we knew what she was saying right there before chatte mo, we would probably be able to translate both this and the previous sentence a little bit better. But you know, that happens. Sometimes you will simply be unable to figure out what a person is saying, even if you're a native speaker. And I think us students of Japanese can make this into a bigger deal than it really is. If something is too hard for you, just come back to it at a later date. Or in a case like this, where even native speakers are struggling to figure out what's being said, just shrug it off and keep moving forward. I'm not sure how long you've been studying Japanese. Maybe everything in this video seems difficult. Maybe only a few things do. I know that I've been studying Japanese for a very, very, very long time, and I had trouble translating this sentence. Still, I'll do my best to explain it. First, she says,
ああ、餅がいい。
mochi ga ii. Here, is like, oh, I means good. And then the word mochi, literally holding, which in this case means something like lasting, like how long a food lasts. So mochi ga ii means long-lasting, keeps well, lasts for a long time. But it's also a play on words because mochi can mean, well, mochi, the food. And if she had said mochi ga ii with mochi, the food, then it means mochi is good. So it's a play on words. And I translated it as, oh, like the mochis for longer. Mochi ga ii.
ああ、餅がいい。
Then skipping that part we can't hear, we have
ああ、餅がいい。餅だけに。
餅だけに餅がいいので食べられる感じはある。
餅だけに餅がいいので食べられる感じはある. Believe it or not, there are only two pieces in these sentences that we've never seen before. No de, which is a way to say because, and then dake ni, which is less easily defined. This NativShark lesson will give some background as to why it is not so easy to pin down the meaning of dake ni. Saying as you'd expect with dake ni, dakeatte. Both dake ni and dakeatte can be used to state that someone or something is as might be expected or as befitting their talent, effort, position, price, experience, etc. Before dake ni or dakeatte, you have some word or phrase, and then you're saying that given considering that word or phrase, what you say next is appropriate or not surprising. For example, if a new employee at your work is young and they are picking things up quickly, then you might say that, as might be expected from a young person, they pick things up quickly. You're talking to your boss about the new employee at work.
若いだけに飲み込みが早いですよね。
若いだけに飲み込みが早いですよね。
Since she's young, she learns very quickly, don't you think? So, young, and then dake means only, so only ni, wakai dake ni. Being young, since she's young, she learns very quickly, don't you think? Back to our sentence. The joke here then is that as befitting, or as you might expect from mochi, the food, it, mochi ga ii, is long-lasting, lasts a long time.
餅がいい。餅だけに
餅だけに餅がいいので食べられる感じはある。
Oh, like the mochis for longer? Yeah, if you something, you can still eat it. It mochis well? The mochis so well that it feels like you can eat it longer. I won't linger on this part any longer because I think I might just confuse the both of us. Perhaps we'll come back to it someday in the future. But hey, the hardest parts of this conversation are now out of the way, and there's only a couple sentences left in part 2.
餅がいい。餅だけに
餅だけに餅がいいので食べられる感じはある。
Start right here.
確かに。
So it's just tashkani. Yeah. Tashka can mean certain or sure, and then if you add ni to the end of it, it becomes tashkani. Certainly, surely, indeed. I almost translated tashkani right here as that's a good point. However, I don't think she really means it to mean much of anything here. She's just saying it the way you might say, yeah, to someone who just said something. So I decided to translate it as, yeah, tashkani, yeah. Regarding pronunciation, note how the i part in shi of tashika is getting devoiced. So listen again.
確かに。
So she's not saying tashika ni, which is what the characters are. That eat sound in sh is getting devoiced, so tashka. Like if you were spelling it with shk, tashka, tashkani. And then she says,
確かに。なんかうちの親とかは硬い餅がめっちゃ好きなの。
You know, my parents love hard mochi. なんかうちの親とかは硬い餅がめっちゃ好きなの. I almost didn't translate the nanka part at the beginning of this sentence. This speaker in particular says nanka a lot, and I didn't want to put like here, but in the end I just decided to go with you know. You know, my parents love hard mochi. Next we have uchi no oya. So oya means parent or parents. Uchi is an interesting word, and it can have a lot of translations depending on how it's used. In this case, it means something like I or we or us. More specifically, it means like my family or in my family, in our home. Whose oya? Parents. Uchi no oya. My parents, the parents of my family. No can be classified as a possessive particle. It can often function similar to apostrophe s, so my family's parents. Then she says toka, which can mean something like and the like or and such and so on. That is, toka can give the nuance that this is not an exhaustive list. There are more things that fall into this category. And as such, it was tempting to me to translate this explicitly and say something like people like my parents or my parents and stuff, things like that. But I was talking today about it and she thought that sounded like an over translation to include that. So ultimately we just stuck with my parents in the translation, and that toka is getting lost in translation. I'm sorry. But I think sometimes a good translation lets things get lost. Wa is a topic marking particle, so we know that the topic now is her parents and the stuff to pay attention to is coming after wa. Katai means hard, as in not soft. Mochi we know is mochi. Ga is a subject marking particle, and here it's pointing to katai mochi, hard mochi. Meccha we've seen means extremely or very, super. Ski, liking, favored. Then nano, which is the same thing as unda. So she could have said skinanda, but she said skinano, just because of her personal preference. Depending on the region you come from and some other factors, that might sound pretty feminine, but it's not like super feminine sounding that she says nano here. Then the other girl responds with,
あ、そうなんだ。
sonanda. Oh, really? We've seen all these before. A is o or a, and sonanda is just a set phrase meaning really, or is that so? Then we have
あえてなんかちょっと硬くして食べてるね。
あえてなんかちょっと硬くして食べてるね. She kind of, that last part sort of like mumbles her words, huh?
あえてなんかちょっと硬くして食べてる。
硬くして食べてるね. They even go so far as to like make it harder. I've mentioned it a few times, but this speaker says nanka a lot. It is a personal quirk that she has developed over her life in speaking Japanese, and you could choose whether or not to adopt that same quirk in your own Japanese. Which native speaker do you want to sound like? This is a fun game to play as you learn the language. Just be careful with fictional characters because they often sound fictional. Just in general, fictional characters in Japanese works of fiction tend to sound more different from the real world than a fictional character in an English work of fiction. So be careful. Don't just copy some character you like in an anime or manga or even a novel, because they might sound a little weird if you were talking like them in the real world. Chotto means a little bit, but like nanka, it doesn't really mean much of anything in this sentence. We saw katai mochi earlier, so mochi is mochi and katai is an i-adjective meaning hard, but she's talking about making something hard, and that's why she says kataku. She puts it into an adverbial form, getting rid of that i and replacing it with ku, katai, kata, kataku. And then she attaches the verb suru onto that, which means to do or to make. So kataku suru means to make hard, only she has it in te form, which is kataku shite, make hard and then she follows that with what they do after making it hard. Tabeteru, are eating. Taberu is to eat. We put it into te form by dropping the ru because it's an ichidan verb, replacing it with te, tabete, and then you put the auxiliary verb iru, tabete iru, only it's spoken language, so she's dropping the i part, tabeteru, is eating, are eating. And finally, she puts ne, the confirmation agreement seeking particle at the end of all that.
あえてなんかちょっと固くして食べてるね。
あえてなんか固くして食べてるね。They make it harder before eating it. 固くして食べてるね。They make it harder before eating it. 固くして食べてるね。And at the very beginning of her sentence, she said, あえて. Many years ago, when I was teaching English in Japan, I had a student who was pretty good at English, and she told me that it is impossible to translate あえて into English. But why don't we try anyway? あえて means something like purposely, deliberately, intentionally. Only it often means these things in reference to something that you think is unnecessary or counterproductive to do. They don't need to make the mochi harder before eating it, but that is what they are intentionally doing. And that's why I used the phrase go so far as to in the English translation. We said they even go so far as to like make it harder.
あえてなんかちょっと固くして食べてるね。
あえてなんかちょっと固くして食べてるね。They even go so far as to like make it harder. Then the response we get to that is
へー。そういう人もいるんだ。へー。そういう人もいるんだ。
Yeah, we just translate that as really because we don't know what she's saying because we can't catch that part in question marks that he and then something ski. So he is just a sound that you make in response to something that's interesting. We translated it as really here. You might feel kind of silly at first making sounds like this when you're speaking Japanese, like he, but it's natural to do so. So you should really embrace it and try to sound like a native speaker. And if you want practice, just watch like a variety show on Japanese TV and watch all the reactions of the guests to the various interesting or shocking facts that they are told. Next, we have our last long sentence in all of part 2.
そういう人もいるんだって思うんだけど、私はもうトロトロのお餅がいいです。
But while some people like mochi like that, I still prefer it to be all gooey. そういう人もいるんだって思うんだけど、私はもうトロトロのお餅がいいです。Aside from marking a question, the particle ka can mean something like or. So if we wanted to explicitly translate it here, we might say or, but we didn't include it at all in our translation because the sentence is already starting with but based on other stuff in the sentence, and we thought that was enough. We don't want to say or, but just we start with but, and we're basically ignoring that ka part, although it literally means or. After ka, she says soyu hito. So soyu means that kind of, and then hito means person. So soyu hito is that kind of person. In other words, the kind of person who likes to eat hard mochi. Mo also iru, there is. Nda, which we have been calling the explanation marker, but I don't think there's a very good label for it in English yet. Someday, making the phrase soyu hito mo iru nda. There are also people like that. Then she puts this in quotes, so to speak, with that te, the quotation marker, and then she uses the verb omo, which means to think. So soyu hito mo iru nda te mo. I think there are also people like that. Then ndakedo is used to indicate that there's more coming after this that she has yet to say. In our translation, we started with but, saying but while some people like mochi that. But yeah, this ndakedo it's a content marker. It indicates that there's more coming later. We've seen it, I think, once or twice before in this video alone. And then she tells us how she likes her mochi. But before we get to that, I do want to admit that this tatemo part of the phrase, I had a really hard time catching it when I was trying to transcribe this Japanese. And then once I asked Bae, my wife, and she told me what it said, I thought, oh yeah, I can totally hear that now. But when I was trying to transcribe it, I just couldn't catch it. See if you can.
そういう人もいるんだって思うんだけど、私はもうトロトロのそういう人もいるんだって思うんだけど、
right here.
いるんだって思うんだけど、いるんだって思うんだけど、いるんだって思うんだけど、いるんだって思うんだけど、いるんだって思うんだけど、
って思うんだけど. Anyway, when I first heard this conversation, when I was listening to the podcast, I didn't get lost when I heard this sentence. I didn't get confused. But once I went to transcribe it, I realized that I was missing pieces that I could not transcribe. And my brain was just filling in the gaps for me because it had a good enough knowledge of Japanese to fill in gaps when it doesn't catch what's being said. And that can happen for you too. So don't be too hard on yourself when you don't catch something. Maybe you also find it interesting that you can catch it once you've seen someone else transcribe it for you, which is cool. Okay, so she continues by reiterating what kind of mochi she likes.
そういう人もいるんだって思うんだけど、私はもうトロトロの餅がいいです。
I think we've seen every part of this second half of the sentence already. Maybe. Let's check. 私 is feminine I. は topic marking particle. も a word to show emphasis or enthusiasm. トロトロ gooey, melty, syrupy. の the possessive particle, which here is pointing out the type of omochi. Mochi that is トロトロ. So トロトロのmochi. And that's omochi with the honorific prefix o. Got the subject marking particle, which is pointing at torotoro no omochi. I, good. And then des, the copula. In other words, just is. Speaking of des, this is a good chance to talk about formality. So des is the formal form of the copula. So the informal counterpart would be da, or just saying nothing, no copula. And the question then is, why is she using formal language in this casual setting? My sense of it is that she's just stating to the world what type of mochi she likes, but you don't really need to think about it that much. Formality is an important part of Japanese, but it's not as clear-cut as you might think from reading textbooks and other things. And in any case, textbooks aren't very good at emulating how people actually talk, be it in casual or formal language. People mix formality a lot in Japanese, so you might be talking to your boss and using formal language, but then you slip in a few casual sentences because maybe you're thinking aloud to yourself or something like that. Or maybe you're using casual language talking to your friend on your podcast, but then you throw in a formal sentence ending like des because that's just what you felt like doing, just to give off a particular nuance that you feel is appropriate. You'll get a sense for these things more and more as you get more exposure to natural sounding Japanese. Anyway, I love how she ends this sentence.
そういう人もいるんだって思うんだけど、私はもうトロトロの餅がいいです。トロトロの餅がいいです。But while some people like mochi like that, I still prefer it to be all gooey. そういう人もいるんだと思うんだけど、私はもうトロトロの餅がいいです。We only have one sentence left in all of part 2, and it's one that I don't think you need my help for because it's just
お餅ね。
お餅ね. Just お餅ね. Although it's pretty hard to hear if she says mochi ne or お餅ね, but They thinks that she's saying お餅ね, so I'm gonna guess that she does include the honorific prefix.
お餅ね。
お餅ね. お餅ね. Let's listen to all of part 2 one more time and see how much you understand now after going through all these breakdowns.
なんかどっちが好き？焼いてある餅を入れるおしること、溶けそうな餅が入ってるおしるこ。
私もこれは圧倒的に溶けそうな餅。
私も溶けそう。
あ、やっぱり
めちゃくちゃ美味しいよね。白いね。
トロトロの餅。あれが最高。いや餅はね、やっぱね、とろけそうなやつの方が好きなんだよね。
そうなんだよね。でも硬い餅の方が、なんかこう食べ損ねても長く食べれる感じはあるよね。
ああ、餅がいい。餅だけに
餅がいいので食べられる感じはある。
確かに。なんかうちの親とかは硬い餅がめっちゃ好きなの。
あ、そうなんだ。
あえてなんかちょっと硬くして食べてるね。
へえ。
そういう人もいるんだって思うんだけど、私はもうトロトロの餅がいいです。
餅ね。
We're almost done with this whole conversation. So finally, in part 3, the topic of the conversation turns to amazake. This is the shortest of the 3 parts, so we're going to get through it relatively quickly. I'll play the whole thing first.
あとはやっぱ甘酒は、でっかい鍋で作られてて、よいしょみたいな入れられるやつがめっちゃ好き。
それを知らんかった。なんか私も紙コップに小分けになったやつをもらって。
それ元は大きい鍋入ってたんだよ、多分。
あ、そうなの？
で、誰か作ってくれてんだよ。
Okay, to start, we had.
あとはやっぱ甘酒は、でっかい鍋で作られてて、よいしょみたいな入れられるやつがめっちゃ好き。
And for amazake, I love it when it's made in one of those huge pots. あとやっぱ甘酒、でっかい鍋で作られてて、みたいな入れられるやつがめっちゃ好き。Ato means after, but when you start a sentence with ato, it can mean in addition or also. In our translation, I just put and for amazake. Yappa, as we've seen, is an abbreviated form of yappari, which can mean after all, as expected. Amazake we know is amazake. Wa is topic marking particle. Then the listener says yeah as aizuchi. Then we have the phrase ano dekai nabe. So nabe, it means pot, like a pot that you cook something in. Dekai is an i-adjective that means something like very big or huge. So dekai nabe is a huge pot or a very big pot. And before that, she says ano dekai nabe. So ano means like that over there. Maybe you remember that earlier we saw are, which also means that over there. And these are the same words, sort of, except for are is a noun and ano is an adjective. I say that both of them mean that over there because it's something that's far away from both the listener and the speaker. If we were talking about something that's far away from the speaker but close to the listener, you could say sore, the noun meaning that, or sono, the adjective meaning that. And if it was something close to both the speaker and the listener, you could say kore, this noun, or kono, this adjective. Although that might sound a little weird depending on your native language, it also sounds a bit straightforward, right? But this gets tricky when we're talking about concepts and not objects. In particular, I always mess up the two that mean that. So ano and sono, or are and sore. For example, why does she say ano dekai nabe? That, so ano, that over there, that big pot over there, and not sono dekai nabe. And you might be able to argue that the reason is that she's like thinking in her mind like that type of big pot over there. And maybe if they had already been talking about a big pot like this, maybe she would have said sono instead. And the truth is that I still mess this up in my Japanese quite frequently. Sometimes I say sono about a concept or something, and when a native speaker would be more likely to say ano, and vice versa. And I mess it up less frequently than I used to, but I still do mess this up sometimes, and it's just something that I'm working on developing vibes for and getting better at. So maybe don't worry about it too much. Just listen to what people say and try to develop a sense for it naturally over time. Anyway, ano dekai nabe de, and she says de because she's talking about the means by which this amazake is made. It's made in with using one of those dekai nabe, huge pots. Ano dekai nabe de tsukurarete te. One of those huge pots, de, is being made. So for tsukurarete te, tsukuru is the verb that means to make or to create, but we want it in the passive form, to be made, to be created. And tsukuru is a godan verb. So to get it in passive form, we take the final u sound and change it to an a sound. So tsukuru, tsukura, and then you add reru. So tsukurareru, to be made. Next, we want to conjugate this passive form verb, tsukurareru. And passive form verbs conjugate as ichidan verbs, which means we're just going to drop off the final ru and replace it with something else. So tsukurareru, tsukurare, and we're going to put that in te form. So tsukurarete, and we're going to add the auxiliary verb iru to the end of it. So tsukurarete iru, is being made. Only that auxiliary verb is also in te form. So tsukurarete ite, and then she drops the i of the auxiliary verb, which is so common. Tsukurarete te. That's why it means is being made. It is the present progressive of a passive form conjugation with a colloquial abbreviation that omits the i part. Don't worry, there's no test on this. They talk over each other for a moment after this, so I'm not totally sure what either of them is saying. This part right here.
作られてて、よいしょみたいな。作られてて、よいしょみたいな入れられる。
I don't know if that isho sound is supposed to be, or if the other girl was saying anything at that time either. But whatever, we'll just let our brains fill in that gap however they like. Let's focus on the other parts of the sentence. So,
あとはやっぱ甘酒は、でっかい鍋で作られてて、よいしょみたいな入れられるやつがめっちゃ好き。
And for amazake, I love it when it's made in one of those huge pots. So we know that mecca means very extremely, and that suki means liking or favored. So mecca suki means love or I really like. Right before that is the subject marking particle ga, and it is pointing at what comes right before it, which is the thing that she loves. And the word here is yatsu, which means thing. But what yatsu? What thing? To know that, we have to look at the entire noun phrase ending in this word yatsu. And the noun phrase starts at ano dekai nabe. So it's ano dekai nabe de tsukurarete te, something something, mitai na irerareru yatsu. So made in a huge pot kind of thing that is put into it. So after that part we couldn't catch, there's this mitai na. Mitai is a na-adjective. That's why that na is coming after it. And it means something like that kind of or that sort of. So mitai na yatsu is that sort of thing, that kind of thing. Only in between mitai na and yatsu we have irerareru. We've seen the verb ireru to insert, to put in, right? And which form do you think it is in here where we say irerareru? The final ru of ireru is dropped and then we add rareru. So ireru, irerareru. And this is kind of a trick question because irerareru could be potential form is able to put into, or it could be passive form is put into. The potential and passive form conjugations are identical for ichidan verbs. For example, taberu is to eat, and taberareru could be either to be able to eat, potential form, or it could be to be eaten, passive form. And you just know from context which one it is. Although if that ra part in taberareru is getting dropped and they're just saying tabereru, then you can be almost certain that its potential form is able to eat. Here I was guessing that she's saying irerareru as passive form because like she's talking about amazake that is put into a dekai nabe, but then they told me that she thinks it's probably potential form, be able to put into, or maybe it was the other way around that we disagreed about it. But long story short, I don't really know what form she's intending to use here. But I mean, whatever. I can understand the sentence as a whole thanks to the context. And, you know, putting all that stuff together, even with the part we couldn't catch, and even with this not knowing if this is passive or potential form, I think we have a passable translation for this, which was, I love it when it's made in one of those huge pots.
あとやっぱ甘酒は、でっかい鍋で作られてて、よいしょみたいな入れられるやつがめっちゃ好き。
And for amazake, I love it when it's made in one of those huge pots. And I have good news for you. The other girl doesn't know what she's talking about either, because she says,
それは知らんかった。なんか私がもう紙コップに小分けになったやつをもらった。
It comes in huge pots? I just got mine in a little paper cup. それは知らんかった。なんか私の紙コップに小分けになったやつをもらった。Let's just pull out that nanka and forget about it. We've seen enough of those. She starts with それは知らんかった. So それ, that, wa, topic marking particle, and 知らんかった, didn't know. The negative form of the verb 知る, to know of, is 知らない. This is a godon verb, and to put it into negative form, vinai form, you take the final u sound, change it to an a sound, so 知る, 知ら, and then you add nai to the end of it, so 知らない, don't know of, don't know, or not aware of. If we then wanted to make that into past tense, we drop off that final i in 知らない, 知らない, and you replace it with かった, so 知らない, 知らな, 知らなかった. In spoken language, however, particularly in casual spoken language, the na in 知らなかった often becomes n, so 知らんかった, didn't know. And this kind of makes sense if you try to say it really fast, right? 知らなかった, 知らなかった, 知らんかった. We're just getting rid of one of those vowels. There are fewer vowels, which means we don't need to expel air from our mouths as many times, which means that we can talk faster. So 知らんかった is easier to say than 知らなかった. So yeah, それは知らんかった means I didn't know that. I didn't know about that. Then she says,
私がもう紙コップに小分けになったやつをもらった。
I just got mine in a little paper cup. So 私の紙コップに小分けになったやつをもらった. So the verb もらう means to receive. And you can't really hear it, but she's saying もらった, received, past tense. And I don't know if the audio is cutting off or what, but you can listen to the end right here.
私がもう紙コップに小分けになったやつをもらった。
Like, kind of seems like it's cutting off, right?
もらった。
もら. But yeah, we know from context she's saying もらった, received, probably. And what did she receive? Well, the object marking particle o coming right before this word is pointing it out for us. And the word right before o is やつ, thing.
になったやつをもらった。
Right here.
なったやつをもらった。
Only やつ is once again at the end of a noun phrase, specifically this one.
紙コップに小分けになったやつ。紙コップに小分けになったやつ。
紙コップに小分けになったやつ. One separated into little cups. Kamikopu is a cool word because it's a mix of a native Japanese word, kami, and a foreign loan word, koppu, cup, giving us kamikopu, paper cup. Then ni, the destination marking particle, because this is the destination to which the amazake was inserted. I have to mention that koppu does not come from the English word cup. It comes from the Dutch word kop. I don't know how to pronounce it. K-O-P. That said, sometimes you'll come across kappe with ka, not ko, and that does come from the English word cup. Usually kappe would refer to a mug cup, so like a mug or a teacup, you know, it has like a little handle on it for you to hold. That's a mug cup. While koppe is a more general word meaning cup, no handle required. Kowake literally means small division, and then ninaru means to become, only it's in past tense. So, になった became. So, 小分けになった literally became divided into small parts. It means something like divided up. Let's hear it again.
紙コップに小分けになったやつ。
One separated into little cups. 紙コップに小分けになったやつ. Okay, and then, yeah, that's what she received.
それを知らんかった。なんか私がもう紙コップに小分けになったやつをもらった。
I just got mine in a little paper cup. At the very beginning of the sentence, she says, 私の. And we've seen a few times now how no is the possessive particle. So it can connect to nouns. So she could have said, 私の甘酒. So my amazake. But she didn't. She just said, 私の. And that's fine because we can infer from the context that she's talking about the amazake that she received. So she can just say, 私の, and we know it means mine. But looking at this sentence, I think it would be easy to get tricked into thinking that she's saying my paper cup because it says 私の紙コップに小分けになったやつをもらった. Because the words next to each other are 私の and 紙コップ. So you'd think it might mean my paper cup, but it doesn't. And that's because she's omitting the topic marking particle wa after no. So she could have said 私のは紙コップに小分けになった blah, blah, blah. But instead she just says 私の, dropping that topic marking particle wa. And including it and over translating it, we could say the sentence is, as for mine, I just got it in a little paper cup. But yeah, that's like an over translation. So I don't think we need to do that. I just got mine in a little paper cup. Seems fine. We are almost done. The other girl then clarifies, saying,
それ元は大きい鍋入ってたんだよ、多分。
But that was probably in a big pot before you got it. でもそれは元は大きい鍋入ってたんだよ、多分. Thanks to all the groundwork we've laid so far, this sentence is pretty straightforward for us to go through. First, there's demo, but although it's basically impossible to hear her say it, listen.
それ元は
But yeah, she does say demo there. But, それ, that, wa, topic marking particle, moto means origin, and then wa, the topic marking particle. And the phrase moto wa is commonly translated as a set, meaning originally, moto wa. Oki, big, nabe, pot. Haiteta was in. Nda, explanation marker. Yo, emphasis marker. Tabu, probably.
それ元は大きい鍋入ってたんだよ、多分。
But that was probably in a big pot before you got it. でもそれは元は大きい鍋入ってたんだよ、多分. And then that is met with the response.
あ、そうなの。
あ、そうなの. Oh, really? We've seen that ah means oh or ah. And we've seen so nanda, which can be translated as really or is that so also, just like so nano. Same translation, only not quite the same meaning. The main difference here is that so nano is an actual question, a genuine question, whereas so nanda is not really a question at all. Perhaps a more accurate translation of so nanda is just oh, but sometimes that doesn't really fit nicely in the larger context. So sometimes we translate it as is that so or really, when if you were genuinely asking that question, it would be so nano and not so nanda. The no at the end of so nano is different from the no that is the same as nda, like we saw in sukinano, I like it. It's not an explanation marker. This no instead is a question marker. Specifically, no is commonly used at the end of a question when you are confirming that something is actually the case. We have a good example of this in a NativShark lesson, so I'm just going to show you that. This lesson is asking questions with no, and I'm going to scroll all the way down to where it says, you're eating potato chips. You hold out the bag of chips to your friend and ask,
食べる?
食べる?
Taberu. Literally eat and then question. Do you want some? And then compare that with this one. You and your friends are at a Korean bar in Okubo, the Korean district of Tokyo. Someone has ordered chicken feet. You think, no way, absolutely not. Then one of your friends grabs one and puts it on his plate. He's gonna eat it. You turn and ask,
食べるの?
食べるの?
Taberu? You're gonna eat that? The no is included because you're confirming if that's actually what's happening here. Anyway, after that sonono question, the other girl says, yeah. And finally, our very last sentence in this entire conversation.
で、誰か作ってくれてんだよ。
And someone made it for you. で、誰か作ってくれてんだよ。I can't say it fast. で、誰か作ってくれてんだよ。Let me hear her say it.
で、誰か作ってくれてんだよ。
で、誰か作ってくれてんだよ。で, as we've seen, can mean so, or and then, or here I just put and as the translation. Dare means who, but when you put ka onto the end of it, it becomes dareka, someone, somebody. The te form of tsukuru, to make, to create, is tsukutte. And when you put kureru onto the te form of a verb, it describes an action being done for you or for your benefit. So 作ってくれる is make for me. Only it doesn't have to be me. It could also be someone who is closer to me psychologically than the person who's doing the action. So that's why she says 作ってくれる here, because she's closer to her friend than she is to the person who made the amazake. To put all that in present progressive, you need to add iru to the te form of this verb. So 作ってくれている. And then normally in spoken language, we would drop that i, right? So 作ってくれてる. Only she's following it with unda. So she could say 作ってくれてるんだ. Only it's very common to also drop the ru part when you're putting unda after this in spoken language. So 作ってくれてんだ is making for you. And then yo is tacked on to the end of that because she's telling the listener something that she presumably does not know.
で、誰か作ってくれてんだよ。
で、誰か作ってくれてんだよ. And someone made it for you. That's it. We made it through the entire conversation. I may have gone too fast for you in some parts of this video. And if that's the case, please don't worry about it too much. You don't have to understand everything the first listen. Just because something feels too fast or too complex right now does not mean that it's going to feel like that forever. Concepts in the language just get less overwhelming and intimidating little by little over time. To illustrate this, let's re-listen to the whole conversation, and I'll do the same thing as before with the Japanese transcription on top and English translation on the bottom. And please try to listen along the same way you did the first time you heard it, whether that means reading the English translation or trying to follow with the transcription, or just closing your eyes or looking away from the screen and listening. And I think you might be pleasantly surprised at how much more you understand than you did with the first listen. Yeah, maybe you don't catch everything. Maybe you don't remember everything. But I bet you catch and remember more than you did the very first time that we listened to this clip. Okay, let's go.
甘酒とおしるこだったらどっちが好き？
うわ、究極の択や。
なんか年明けて、夜中の12時過ぎぐらいに、一番近くの神社に行ったんだけど、そこで甘酒とおしるこが売られてたってか、自由に取っていいよってなってて、すごい悩んで甘酒にしたの、私は。
私も甘酒かも。
でもなんか母親がおしるこ取ってて、で一口飲ませてもらったんだけど、ちょっとおしるこめっちゃうまかった。
マジか。
でなんかあれおしるこにすればよかったかなって一瞬思ったね。
なんかどっちが好き？焼いてある餅を入れるおしること、溶けそうな餅が入ってるおしるこ。
私もこれは圧倒的に溶けそうな餅。
私も溶けそう。
あ、やっぱり
めちゃくちゃ美味しいよね。白いね。
トロトロの餅。あれが最高。いや餅はねやっぱねとろけそうなやつの方が好きなんだよね。
そうなんだよね。でも硬い餅の方が、なんかこう食べ損ねても長く食べれる感じはあるよね。
ああ、餅がいい。餅だけに
餅がいいので食べられる感じはある。
確かに。なんかうちの親とかは硬い餅がめっちゃ好きなの。
あ、そうなんだ。
あえてなんかちょっと硬くして食べてるね。
へえ。
そういう人もいるんだって思うんだけど、私はもうトロトロの餅がいいです。
餅ね。あとはやっぱ甘酒は、でっかい鍋で作られてて、よいしょみたいな入れられるやつがめっちゃ好き。
それを知らんかった。なんか私も紙コップに小分けになったやつをもらった。
それは元は大きい鍋入ってたんだよ、多分。
あ、そうなの？
で、誰か作ってくれてんだよ。
That's it. If you stuck with me for this whole video and you've been watching my facial hair get longer and longer because it's taking me many days to record all of this, I just want to congratulate you. Most people don't put this much effort into their Japanese studies. Most people will not watch this video from start to finish. And an even smaller percentage than that will stick to their Japanese studies long term. That's the real challenge to learning this language. It's not kanji, it's not grammar, it's not how fast these girls are talking or the way they mumble their words sometimes. It's figuring out a way to show up consistently for the long term. If you haven't checked out NativShark yet, please do. It's designed specifically to help you show up consistently day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year. If I were to make videos like this one for all the content we have on NativShark, I would need hundreds or maybe thousands of them. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and good luck with your studies. If you have any questions about something from this video or about learning Japanese in general, feel free to leave a comment, or even better, go check out our free Discord community. You don't need to use NativShark to join, and people are very nice and knowledgeable in there. We would love to have you. I'll put a link in the description. じゃあね。
この番組はフューチャーラーニングメソッドネイティブシャークがお送りしました。